Hey everybody, this is a chapter from Diethard, Behrens, and Kornelia Hafner's Western Marxism and Introduction. This chapter is titled Systematizing Approach or Preliminary Reflections on the Genesis of a New Perspective. This is quite a long chapter, and I might be able to find some way of breaking it down, but I'm doubtful. Anyway, a systematizing approach or preliminary reflections on the genesis of a new perspective. When addressing the question of how Western Marxism might be more precisely defined, one must bear in mind that it is represented by diverse figures who were active over a considerable span of time, in various locations, and at different historical moments. It must also be taken into account that Western Marxism is not represented solely by theorists, but constitutes rather a specific form of political factionalization. Here, by way of an initial approach, we introduce those theorists who do not occupy a central position in the subsequent course of this exposition. Moreover, these figures are organized according to a cultural political schema. New section, Beyond Hagiography. Generally speaking, Antonio Gramsci is classified among the representatives of Western Marxism. While this classification is in certain respects justified, it is on the whole problematic. The following reasons may be adduced to highlight the problematic nature of this attempted classification. The early Gramsci, as a theorist heavily influenced by Courset, is rooted in a neo-idealism modeled on Courset's philosophy. The early Gramsci, in stark contrast to the later Gramsci, acting as the political architect of the Communist Party of Italy, was not part of a movement opposed to that party. Rather, Gramsci aligned himself with Leninism. Thus, the focus here lies on the reflections of the later Gramsci, reflections that can be considered solely in the context of an affiliation with Western Marxism. And there's some footnotes here. Footnote, see, however, by way of introduction, Gerhard Roth's Gramsci's Philosophie der Praxis, published in Düsseldorf, 1972. See Atos Lisa, Memory Incarcere con Gramsci. Preface by U. Terracini, 1973. Perry Anderson, Antonio Gramsci, published in Germany in 1979. Giuseppe Fiori, Das Leben des Antonio Gramsci, published in Berlin 1979. Walter L. Adamson, Hegemony and Revolution, a study of Antonio Gramsci's political and cultural theory, published in 1980. Franz Kaminsky, Heiner Karnscheit, Klaus Winter. Antonio Gramsci, Philosophy und Praxis, Grundlage und Wirkung der Gramsci-Debatte, published in Frankfurt 1982. For background, see Gerhard Kuck's edited volume, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels in Italien. Schriften aus dem Karl Marx Haus. For background, see Gerhard Kuck's edited volume, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels in Italien. Teil 1, Paolo Favilli, Herausgabe und Verbreitung der Werke von Karl Marx und Friedrich Engels in Italien. Schriften aus dem Karl Marx Haus, number 4/1, Trier, 1988. Gerhard Kuck's edited volume, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels in Italien, Teil 2, Die Entwicklung des Marxismus in Italien, Vega Verbeitung, Besonderheiten, Vorträge. Schriften aus dem Karl Marx Haus, number 40. Emilio Gianni, The Division of Marxism in Italy from 1848, the diffusion of Marxism in Italy from 1848 to 1926, in Beiträge zur Marx-Engels-Forschung, Neue Folgen, 2007. In what follows, Gramsci is cited A, according to corresponding German editions, B, according to corresponding Italian editions, C, according to Italian references provided within German editions. And footnote. Footnote. See the account provided in the first part here. The extent to which this classification holds true will become apparent in the subsequent discussion. Footnote. However, insofar as it is relevant to the present discussion, reference is also made to the early and middle periods of Gramsci's work. End footnote. Back to the text. In the 1980s, when postmodernism appeared to be gaining dominance, the thesis regarding the obsolescence of social theory emerged within the Italian intellectual debate. The notion was not directed solely at Gramsci. It simultaneously sought to bury any prospect of social change, and by extension, Marxian theory itself. Footnote. See Andras Guédou, Der Marxismus als geschichtliche Philosophie, Gramsci's Denkwege im Spannungsfeld von, quote, absolutem Historismus, unquote, und materialistischer Dialektik. Marxism is historical philosophy, Gramsci's lines of thought in the field of tension between, quote, absolute historicism and materialist dialectic, published in Heinz Holtz and Giuseppe Prestipino's edited volume Antonio Gramsci Heute, Antonio Gramsci Today. See regarding critical Marx on philosophy, Emilio Agazzi, Cesare Bermani et al., Gramsci un eredita contrastata, la nuova sinistra rileggia, Gramsci, 1979. End footnote. Nor has there been any, back to the body, nor has there been any shortage of attempts to situate Gramsci's theory within philosophical frameworks other than Marxism, thereby as a side effect dematerializing his work. Footnote. See Andreas Guédou's Der Marxismus. Particular references made here to Antonio Passi, Funzione delle Scienze e Significato dell'Uomo, Milan, 1963. Roberto Bobbio, Introduzione in Rodolfo Mondolfo's Medesimo di Marx, Studi Filosofici, 1908 to 1966, published in 1968, and footnote. Gramsci's theory is, however, above all else, a form of practical philosophy. As a political philosophy, Gramsci's theory is imbued with a critical impulse, one directed against a Marxist positivism that was traditional, contemporary, and above all cultivated in the post-1945 era. Footnote. Cited as opponents are Ludovico Gay-Monat and Enzo Banfi, who argued from the perspective of the Vienna Circle, or respectively its transcendentalist reformulation, as well as Palmiro Tagliati and Eugenio Gardin. A position largely untouched by Gramsci, yet contrary to his, is found in Della Volpe, and following him in Mario Tanti and Lucio Coletti. On the pragmatism of Giulio Preti, see Otto Karlscheuer's Marxismus, abbreviated book Marxismus, and Andres Guédou, Der Marxismus, also an abbreviated text. By way of example, see Lucio Coletti, Intervista Politico-Filosofica, Rome, 1974. The dimension of Gramsci's philosophy, critical of positivism, has evidently, in part, disappeared in more recent attempts to integrate Gramsci into the social sciences. See Ursula Apich, edited volume Neurath Gramsci Williams, Theorien der Arbeiterkultur und ihrer Wirkung, Theories of Working Class Culture and Their Impact, published in Hamburg, Berlin, 1993. From the perspective of a Marxist functionalism, Gramsci's philosophy is discussed by Krebs. See Hans-Peter Krebs, Führt Philosophie ein geschichtliches Eigenleben. Gramsci's Umgang mit Giambattista Vico und der Geschichte der Philosophie. Does philosophy lead a historical life of its own? Gramsci's engagement with Giambattista Vico and the History of Philosophy, published in Das Argument, 1990. A striking counterposition to Gramsci's critique of positivism can be found in Kolakowski, who on the one hand attempts to accuse Gramsci of anti-scientism, specifically where Gramsci incorporates, quote, the history of nature into the history of man, and quote, yet on the other hand insists that the objectivism of nature is ultimately religiously conditioned. See Leszek Kolakowski, Die Hauptströmungen des Marxismus, Main Currents of Marxism, Volume 3. End footnote. However, more recent Gramscianism has also frequently revealed a tendency to link, quote, the philosophical interpretation of Gramsci directly to the current strategies and tactics of the revolutionary workers' movement, end quote. See Andres Guido. See regarding the debate surrounding Gramsci by way of example, Nicola Badoni, Il Marxismo Italiano degli anni 60, 1971, Cesare Luperini, Dialettica e Materialismo, 1974, Gianni Francioni, La Officina Gramsciana, Ipotesi sulla struttura dei quaderni la carcere. Yeah. See Giuseppe Bedeschi, Il Marxismo, in A. Balsola et al., La filosofia italiana dal dopoguerra a oggi, 1985, Jean-Pierre Potier, Lecture italienne de Marx, 1883-1983, published in Lyon, 1986, Guido Liguori, Etappen der Gramsci Reception, published in Das Argument, 1997. See the comprehensive research report on Gramsci interpretations, Guido Liguori, Gramsci Contesto, Storia di un Dibattito, 1922-1996, published in 1996. End footnote. Focusing on the philosophical Gramsci, Guido points out that, quote, dialectic serves as a key concept, end quote, in Gramsci's work, acting as an immanent counterpoint to historicism. Historical thinking is regarded as a corrective to pragmatism and possesses a dimension of practical relevance with respect to politics. Footnote. Reference is made to the concept of see Andras Guido. Reference is made to the, quote, concept of real and cognitive historicity within Gramsci, with which Gramsci grappled, end quote. That is, to the reflection on the, quote, relationship between theory and history, end quote. Behrens disputes both the designation of, quote, Marxism and the existence of dialectics. See Christian Behrens, Antonio Gramsci, Marxismus in Italian. In the edited volume Gramsci, Philosophie der Praxis, a selection, 1967. And footnote, quote, in this situation, the concept of the historicity of the philosophical theory of Marxism implies critical scrutiny as well as the approach of a new beginning, following the rupture of a historical setback, It constitutes the alternative to that ahistorical pragmatism which has permeated the handling of Marxist philosophy, indeed of Marxism as a whole, for many years, end quote. Andras Gedou. Gramsci's recourse to, quote, politics as history, end quote, while arguably purchased at the cost of foregoing an intensive engagement with, quote, economics as reality and theory, end quote. Gedou nevertheless permits via Hegel of reformulation of praxis. See in this regard Antonio Gramsci, Il Nostro Marx, 1918 and 1919, published in Turin, 1984. End footnote. The starting point of Gramsci's theory is marked by a twofold opposition against the neo-idealism of Courset, which was dominant in Italy, and against, quote, traditional Marxism, end quote. Footnote. Quote, Gramsci posits a twofold revision of Marxism during the 1920s. On the one hand, Marxist elements were explicitly or implicitly incorporated by idealist currents. On the other hand, the so-called, quote, orthodox sought to interpret and further develop Marxian theory in a manner that ultimately led to its equation with traditional materialism, end quote. Annegret Kramer, Gramsci's Interpretation des Marxismus, Gramsci's Interpretation of Marxism, published in 1975. Albers points in one instance to Bauer's Darwinian Marxism, and in another to his numerous physicalist examples. Bauer too seeks to historicize Marxian theory, though unlike Gramsci, Bauer does so from an archival perspective. See Detlef Albers' Versuch über Otto Bauer und Antonio Gramsci zur politischen Theorie der Marxismus. Essays on Otto Bauer and Antonio Gramsci on the political theory of Marxism. Haug notes that Lenin had criticized Marx and Engels for being insufficiently materialist. Althusser applied this finding to Gramsci's theory in his critique of Gramsci. See Wolfgang Fritz Haug, Philosophieren mit Brecht und Gramsci. What is overlooked here is that Gramsci's remarks are directed critically against a tradition to which Lenin himself in certain respects belonged. End footnote. This intellectual struggle against traditional Marxism and the neo-idealism of Courset was all the more significant to Gramsci, given that Gramsci himself had been rooted in neo-idealism, a tradition that, among other things, led Gramsci to view the human being primarily as a spiritual entity. Footnote. See Gramsci, Sozialismus und Kultur, Socialism and Culture, in Grido del Popolo, January 29, 1916, cited here from Sabina Kabir's edited volume, Antonio Gramsci, Marxismus und Literatur, Ideologie, Alltag, Literatur. Marxism and Literature, Ecology, Everyday Life, Literature. On the other hand, Gramsci early on resisted a dominant anthropologism, a point to which Kolakowski draws attention. End footnote. This view is subsequently corrected, particularly in light of his reflections on modern industry, and replaced by the affirmation of a, quote, universality of the human labor element, end quote, which he argues must be given its due. Footnote. See Ursula Apich, Antonio Gramsci, Arbeiterkultur als Modell einer neuen Civilität. Antonio Gramsci, Working Class Culture as a Model for a New Civiltà in some edited volume. It must be borne in mind, however, that a utopianism regarding the development of labor is simultaneously present in Gramsci's work. End footnote. The specific Italian situation is transcended through the adoption of an international perspective. Designed to facilitate the conceptualization of theory within a broader context. From its very starting point, Gramsci also seeks to relativize the significance of economics in relation to practice and politics. Footnote. See on Sotto la Mole. See Attilio Mangiano, Sotto la Mole, 1916 to 1920, and Emilio Agassi's et al.'s edited volume, Gramsci, un eredita contrastata, la nuova sinistra rilegge Gramsci. Gramsci, a contested legacy. The New Left reads Gramsci, 1979. Footnote, 2018. See Tom. I don't know why I said 2018. That's the footnote number. That's not reference to a year. See Thomas Behrens, Insel in der Insel. Fremdheit und Entfremdung by Gramsci. Island within an island. Otherness and alienation in Gramsci. Published in Uwe Hirschfeld's edited volume, Gramsci Perspektiven, Gramsci Perspectives. Insofar as Behrens addresses Marx's, quote, Jewish question, it becomes evident that, in assuming Marx follows Bruno Bauer, transforming the latter's critique of the, quote, religious segregation of the Jews, end quote, into the assertion regarding the, quote, disintegration of the entire bourgeois society through self-interest and money, end quote. He has fundamentally misunderstood Marx's inquiry into an analysis of the problems concerning society and the state. End footnote. Back to the body. From this very starting point, Gramsci also seeks to relativize the significance of economics in relation to practice and politics. Furthermore, politics is subjected to criticism insofar as politics is conceived merely as a technique. Footnote, quote, a technological conception of the relationship between theory and practice, end quote, Kolakowski notes. It leads, he argues, inevitably to an instrumentalization of theory, end footnote. Gramsci's critique of economism carries far-reaching implications. Most centrally, it targets the, quote, reflection theory, correspondence theory, and a fatalistic approach to political economy. Footnote, although Haug's interpretation, which presumes that Gramsci's critique of economism is directly applicable to Marx's Capital, and that a concept of a, quote, consciously anti-economistic reading of Marx's critique of political economy, end quote, is to be uncovered therein, is misguided. Haug's reference to Lenin's critique of reformism and syndicalism is nonetheless apposite. For both Lenin and Gramsci identify in these movements a tendency toward, quote, material fatalism, end quote, insofar as a technical understanding of social processes shines through their economism, to the extent that is that they actually subscribe to such a view. See Wolfgang Fritz Haug, What is Economism? The Critique of Economism in Lenin and Gramsci. End footnote. Forgive that yawning gap. And forgive that sneeze. Christ, I'm a mess. Philosophy, in contrast to traditional materialism, is to be understood as a specific mediating instance. In this regard, Gramsci largely follows Labriola. Consequently, Bukharin's work, Theory of Historical Materialism, also falls subject to criticism. In that work, Marxism is presented as a natural science-oriented sociology which, by emphasizing law, causality, regularity, and normality, seeks to impose a, quote, mechanical coherence upon, quote, historical and political facts, end quote. A move which, as Gramsci criticizes, renders practice impossible. Bukharin's theory of development is characterized as, quote, vulgar evolutionism, end quote, which conceives of, quote, historical development as a qualityless uniformity, end quote. Bukharin's work leads to, quote, a new form of nominalism, end quote, falling short of a true grasp of real dialectics, a dialectics that is thereby merely, quote, degraded into a subdivision of formal logic and an elementary scholasticism, end quote. In this framework, philosophy is reduced to mere metaphysics. Marxist sociology becomes nothing more than positivism. However, Gramsci's opposition extends beyond his critique of Bukharin to target, more generally, the, quote, positivist notion of encyclopedic knowledge, end quote. Number of footnotes here. Footnote. Albers emphasizes Gramsci's positive engagement with Labriola's understanding of philosophy. See Detlef Albers and Frank Deppa's Politisches Denken zwischen den Weltkriegen, 2003. With regard to a line of argument similar to Gramsci's, Labriola had stated, quote, we gladly accept the epithet, quote, scientific, provided that one does not thereby intend to lump us together with the positivists. At times, irksome figures who seek to establish a monopoly over, quote, science, end quote, end quote. Antonio Labriola. And footnote. Footnote. See Nikolai Bukharin, Theorie des historischen Materialismus, Gemeinverständliches Lehrbuch der marxistischen Soziologie, published in German in 1922, and Gramsci's commentaries in the prison notebooks. Footnote. See Annegret Kramer. Quote, conversely, the application of statistical laws in political theory presupposes that the broad mass of the population remains essentially passive, end quote. Actually, I'm not quite sure who that quote is from, actually. It's not precisely clear. Footnote. For Gramsci's epistemology, see Giorgio Baratta, Das Dialogische Denken Antonio Gramsci's, published in 2003. End footnote. Back to the body. The, quote, philosophy of praxis is understood as a theory of practical action. In this context, praxis is conceived as the process of the subaltern classes attaining self-consciousness and appropriating, quote, competence for action, end quote, a process that implies a critical reflection upon their own conditions. It is, therefore, primarily a matter of, quote, a hermeneutics of social learning processes, end quote. Here, Gramsci places particular emphasis on the following. Quote, we must create sober and patient people, people who do not despair in the face of the worst horrors and do not become enthused by every piece of foolishness, end quote. Gramsci. Quote, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, end quote. Gramsci. Some number of footnotes here. According to Haug, this concept, I'm not sure precisely what concept, I think it's philosophy of praxis, denotes a mere reformulation of historical materialism against the backdrop of a, quote, critique of economism addressed to nascent Marxism-Leninism, end quote, and contains above all, quote, a critique of the neo-idealisms, end quote, of Giovanni Gentile and Benedetto Croce. End footnote. Footnote. See Hartmut Krause's Gramsci's Beitrag zur Grundlegung einer subjektwissenschaftlichen Perspektive im Marxismus. Gramsci's contribution to laying the foundations for a subject-scientific perspective in Marxism. In Uwe Hirschfeld's edited volume, Gramsci Perspektiven. End footnote. Gramsci, too, emphasizes a historization of history, one determined by contemporary political practice. Footnote. Lenin's practical politics and philosophy, Albers argues, represent a further development of Marx's, though this does not apply to Lenin's work Materialism and Empirical Criticism. The, quote, October Revolution thus marks, quote, the transition of Marxism from science to action to, quote, real dialectics, end quote, as Albers interprets Gramsci's position. End footnote. Gramsci views contemporary political practice, both subjective and collective, as a moment just as central as its ultimate success. In Gramsci's understanding of history, Gramsci seeks above all to distance Gramsci's self from Croce, specifically when Gramsci takes a stand against, quote, the reduction of history to a merely ethico-political history, end quote. In this respect, Gramsci once again aligns himself here with the philosophy of Labriola. Footnote. See Valentino Garetana, Labriola e Gramsci. Valentino Garetana describes Gramsci's engagement with Luria in Avanti in 1918, during the course of which Gramsci draws upon Labriola and praises Labriola for having made a solid start for Marxism in Italy. While working on the prison notebooks, the reference to Labriola becomes evident once again. Now Gramsci praises Labriola for having been the only one to have envisioned a construction of Marxism. End footnote. Following in Labriola's footsteps, and adopting Labriola's tripartite framework of philosophy, critique of political economy, and politics, Gramsci endeavors to conceive of Marxism as an original, independent new conceptualization, as a moment within the historical development of the world, as an emergent culture evolving in accordance with prevailing social relations. Footnote. Nicola Battelloni also points out that an incipient approach to a new social pedagogy can be found in Labriola's work. End footnote.
Footnote. In this respect, following Bock, B-O-C-K, Mende, for instance, M-E-N-D-E, regards Gramsci as a figure who, quote, extended the thinking of Lenin's writings within the tradition of the Italian Communist Party, end quote. See Jana Mende, Ideologie, Basis, Überbau und Wahrheit, Dialektische Kategorien bei Antonio Gramsci, in Stefan Müller's edited volume Probleme der Dialektik heute, published in 2009. See Gisela Bock's review of Mas Imo El Salvadori, Jean-Marc Piot, Leonardo Paggi, in Archiv für Sozialgeschichte. End footnote. So let me repeat that last sentence. Following in Labriola in the body text. Following in Labriola's footsteps and adopting Labriola's tripartite framework of philosophy, critique of political economy, and politics, Gramsci endeavors to conceive of Marxism as an original, independent, new conceptualization, as a moment within the historical development of the world, and as an emergent culture, evolving in accordance with prevailing social relations. A constitution of history, mindful of the consciousness of necessary self-transformation, aims toward a, quote, total integral civilization, end quote, and in its historicity constitutes pure humanism and an element of philosophical thought. The philosophy of praxis thus signifies a historicity capable of affirming the worldly immanence of philosophy and identifying it as a historical dialectic. Within contradictory history, it serves as both the expression and the consciousness of that history. Footnote. With this construction, Gramsci simultaneously undermines a deterministic conception of base and superstructure, a conception Gramsci moreover considers detrimental to the concrete politics of the subaltern classes. For, quote, the history of a people is not documented solely by economic facts, end quote. Gramsci. End footnote. However, Gramsci's concept of, quote, absolute historicism, end quote, a synonym for Marxism, carries two implications. On the one hand, that it must be distinguished from that form of historicism Gramsci regards as, quote, historical relativism, and on the other, that it points to a specific determination of time, such as that associated with trench warfare, conceived as a strategic and historicized temporal determination. History, according to Gramsci, is nothing but, quote, the free development of free energies, energies born free and freely complementing one another, distinct from evolution in nature, because human beings and human groups differ from molecules and molecular groups, end quote. Gramsci. The task of the philosophy of praxis, which recognizes both in itself and in the people that they sometimes give scope to narrowness and prejudice, must lie in ideology critique. In popular enlightenment and in politics. Footnote. Ideologies are regarded as worldviews and are distinguished into categories of folklore, common sense, religion, and philosophy. Specifically, quote, arbitrary ideologies, and, quote, reconciliatory ones termed, quote, unorganic ideologies, and, quote, are distinguished from those that are historically, quote, necessary for a specific structure, end quote. I'm not sure if that quote is from if that's quotes from Gramsci or not. And footnote. Moving on. Kant, back to the body. Consequently, philosophy in the strict sense is also conceived in a different light. Footnote. On the one hand, philosophy is upheld in an emphatic sense. On the other, a picture of ideology is sketched out within a first graduated schema, one in which the following are deemed to constitute ideology: everyday understanding, everyday consciousness, religion as a systematic entity, science, art, and philosophy. See Thomas Mecher, Historizismus, Humanismus und konkrete Subjektivität, Überlegungen zu Antonio Gramsci's Beitrag zu einer marxistischen Theorie der Ideologie und Kultur, Historicism, Humanism, and Concrete Subjectivity, Reflections on Antonio Gramsci's Contribution to a Marxist Theory of Ideology and Culture. In Hans-Heinz Holtz and Hans-Jörg Sandkühler's edited volume, Gramsci, Philosophy and Revolutionäre Politik in Italien, Gramsci, Philosophy and Revolutionary Politics in Italy. In a second schema, these elements are then dualized so that they may be conceived qua ideology as being aufgehoben, sublated, transcended through critique. The graduation undertaken here indicates that only a quantitative difference is being posited, with the consequence that any mediation is bound to fail, and that, ultimately, the masses must be educated. In this respect, it is not incorrect for Menda to emphasize that Gramsci's struggle against ideology remains itself conceived in instrumental terms. Jana Menda's own approach, however, escapes this mechanics and this, quote, metaphorology of interaction, end quote, just as little. See also the replacement of dialectics with mechanical effects in the relationship between base and superstructure. End footnote. The separation between, quote, high philosophy and, quote, common sense, end quote, is tentatively breached when it is emphasized that all human beings are philosophers. Footnote. This corresponds to the separation of manual and mental labor. Regarding the latter, it is posited, quote, like the representatives of earlier critical theory and later Pierre Bourdieu, as well, Gramsci assumes that, by virtue of their specific function within the social division of labor, intellectuals shape society's cognitive capacities in a distinct manner, namely through concepts, patterns of rationality, and technical instruments, end quote. Alex Demirović. On footnote. Quote, this is back to the body. Quote, in philosophy, the characteristics of the individual elaboration of thought stand out. In common sense, by contrast, the scattered and confused characteristics of a general mode of thinking belonging to a specific epoch or a specific popular milieu, end quote. Gramsci, in Notes for an Introduction and Introduction to the Study of Philosophy and the History of Culture. Footnote, yet every philosophy, at least that of intellectuals, strives to become the common sense of a specific limited milieu. End footnote. Gramsci is concerned with the unity of feeling and intellect, and, mediated through this, with the relationship of these to society as the starting point of thought. Footnote, quote, the transition from knowing to understanding, to feeling, and vice versa, from feeling to understanding, to knowing, the, quote, popular element, feels feels but does not always understand or know the quote intellectual, does not always understand or know, period, or comma. The quote intellectual element knows but does not always understand, and in particular does not always feel. Kolakowski takes issue with this approach. Quote, neither philosophy nor science is judged by criteria other than those we employ when evaluating social institutions, religious beliefs, emotions, or political movements, end quote. Kolakowski. This quote, anti-positivist and anti-scientistic relativism, end quote, Kolakowski argues, constitutes Gramsci's, quote, most intrinsic conception of Marxism, end quote. Kolakowski. If Kolakowski accuses Gramsci's epistemology of being a form of, quote, social functionalism, end quote, viewed against the backdrop of Kolakowski's own Catholic positivism, this charge appears easily refutable. Another question is whether a nominalism, one that sometimes entails mechanistic consequences, does not, in fact, insidiously play a role in Gramsci's thought. Apich points out that this passage is directed against Demon and should be read ironically. However, Apich overlooks the ambivalence inherent in the passage in a twofold sense, one that is ironic and another that critiques the self-limitation of the intellectual's activity. End footnote. Back to the body. The relationship between philosophy and common sense is also determined by politics, and is constitutively embedded within a different progressive perspective. Footnote, quote, the relationship between higher philosophy and common sense is secured by, quote, politics, just as the relationship between the Catholicism of intellectuals and that of, quote, simple people is secured by politics, end quote. Gramsci. Notes for an introduction and preliminary study of philosophy. End footnote. Footnote, unlike the Catholic Church, the philosophy of Praxis seeks to forge a bond between the simple person and the intellectual, quote, in order to construct an intellectual moral block that is intended to make the intellectual progress of the masses politically possible, end quote. Gramsci. And footnote, back to the body. I'll reread that last sentence. The relationship between philosophy and common sense is also determined by politics and is constitutively embedded within a different progressive perspective. Essential here, however, is that the philosophy of Praxis must be, above all, a, quote, critique of common sense, end quote, a common sense upon which it had previously relied, in order subsequently to proceed to a, quote, critique of intellectuals, end quote. This engagement then takes place within the sphere of culture. And that quote was from Gramsci. Culture is a contested terrain. With this in mind, Gramsci directs Gramsci's critique primarily against the class-based educational system, but also against the a-religious affect of modernity, as Gramsci perceives it in the work of Croce. Gramsci's criticism targets both Croce's elite theoretical construction of history and his, quote, identification of state and hegemony, end quote, an identification which, in Gramsci's view, leads to the reduction of history to a purely ethical political dimension. There's a couple of footnotes here, or it's actually just one footnote. If history appears, quote, as a succession of reform activities by intellectual elites, end quote, as, quote, cultural expansion, end quote, this is erroneous, if only because it abstracts from the intertwining of culture with violence and economics. End footnote. Regarding an analysis of the relationship between history, politics, and culture, a different approach is required. An empirically grounded investigation of, quote, popular culture and, quote, Volkskultur must be chosen as the starting point. This is deemed necessary because, within popular cultural content, the following elements must be distinguished: an internalized ideology, a specific folklore, a particular mode of literary reception, and a mass culture. While Gramsci's interest extends to trivial and commercial culture, Gramsci's critique is directed primarily at the Catholic Church provided for the people. Thus, Gramsci is concerned here with what Gramsci terms, quote, popular culture, unquote. Where am I? Where the hell am I? Shit. Okay. Back to the body, or still in the body. I can't remember what place I am. Quote, popular culture is defined broadly and comprehensively. On the one hand, the term, quote, popular culture denotes the use of specific cultural goods by the people, goods which Gramsci assumes to be consonant with their nature. On the other hand, it refers to the reception of all manner of media. Of particular significance in this context is Italian folklore, which remains a vibrant living tradition, especially in southern Italy. When folklore is examined as the worldview and philosophy of life of specific social strata, it becomes evident that there exists a, quote, close relationship between folklore and, quote, common sense, end quote, unquote. That is, between folklore and philosophy. As Alberto M. Cirezzi notes, Gramsci views folklore as a reflection of the conditions of the cultural life of, quote, the people, end quote. However, the, quote, people are said to be by no means a monolithic entity, but rather to exhibit numerous diverse perspectives. These aspects are therefore of interest. 1. Folklore as an object of practical science. 2. A socio-cultural phenomenon. And 3. The association of folklore with the lower classes as a form of opposition. In Gramsci's work, folklore and, quote, spontaneous philosophy, end quote, are placed in a specific intimate relationship. For Gramsci, folklore appears both as an object of inquiry and as a vital force of real life. There's some footnotes. Quote, Footnote, quote, among the popular classes, there also exists a degeneration of life stemming from the, quote, book tradition, one that is mediated not only by books, but also by other media that disseminate culture and ideas, end quote. Gramsci, in the piece, The Melodramatic Conception of Life. As an example, Gramsci cites Verdi's librettos, which Gramsci deems, quote, responsible, quote, for a whole series of, quote, artificial attitudes in the life of the people, end quote, Gramsci. Footnote, quote, popular morality is said to be embedded within folklore. Footnote, see Alberto M. Cereze, Conception du Monde, Philosophie Spontanée, Folklore, translated by Dominique Gautier in Dialectique, 1974. Moreover, a distinction must be drawn between an active and a passive role in the enactment of this oppositional function. End footnote. With regard to, back to the body, with regard to popular literature, Gramsci repeatedly points out that the, quote, people in 19th century Italy lived under the dominance of French literature. Thus, attention is drawn, among other things, to the role and reception of the writings of Eugène Sue, or Eugene Sue. Gramsci treats this literature as a significant factor influencing the general consciousness of the subaltern classes. Footnote, this applies to artistic and stylistic movements up to and including Futurism. Marinetti studied in Paris. Accordingly, the first manifesto of Futurism was published in French. And footnote. Footnote, quote, the socioeconomic, quote, proposals of Eugene Sue are linked to certain tendencies within Saint-Simonism. Tendencies that are in turn connected to theories of the, quote, organic state and to philosophical positivism. Saint-Simonism also enjoyed a direct popular dissemination in Italy, end quote. Gramsci, in the piece titled The Popular Influence of the Romantic French Serial Novel, published in Prison Notebooks 3. Elsewhere, Gramsci cites Posner, who observed that Dostoevsky's novels followed in the tradition of the serial novel a la Eugene Sue, and suggests that Dostoevsky could therefore be classified within the tradition of popular literature. See Gramsci, Cultural Influences of the Serial Novel, in Prison Notebooks, Notebook 21. The popular content, which the people supposedly prefer, should be presented by, quote, great artists. Here, Gramsci immediately follows up with his own interpretation, formulating that Nietzsche's, quote, Übermensch has its origin and its doctrinal model in The Count of Monte Cristo, end quote. Gramsci, in the article The Popular Origin of the, quote, Übermensch, in Prison Notebook 16. In this way, Gramsci sees the dividing line between popular literature and, quote, high literature disappear. End footnote. Back to the body. The products of mass culture must also be taken into account when analyzing popular culture, as they constitute forms of consciousness situated in the sphere of what Gramsci terms, quote, industrialism. Footnote, according to Kabir, Gramsci was the first, quote, to consistently and extensively apply historicization to the phenomena of mass culture, end quote. such as popular fiction. End footnote. Footnote. Gramsci situates culture socially in stark contrast to the contemporary phenomenon of culturalism. In this latter context, exemplified by Lemfel following Ulbert, culture is, quote, redefined. I guess he's referring to culturalism. Quote, culture as value orientation and lifestyle, culture as a construct of collectively constructed and intersubjectively shared meaning, and culture as a repertoire of action strategies, end quote. Ursula Lempfel, in the piece Diplomatische Geschichte als internationale Kulturgeschichte, theoretische Ansätze und empirische Forschung zwischen historischer Kulturwissenschaft und soziologischem Institutionalismus. History of diplomacy is international cultural history. Theoretical approaches and empirical research between historical cultural studies and sociological institutionalism. Published in Geschichte und Gesellschaft, History and Society, 2001. See also Cornelia Ulbert's Deconstructed von Umwelt, der Einfluss von Ideen, Institutionen und Kultur auf internationale Klimapolitik in den USA und der Bundesrepublik Deutschland. The construction of the environment, the influence of ideas, institutions, and culture on international climate policy in the USA and the Federal Republic of Germany, published in 1997. End footnote. Back to the body. Not only in this context, but generally speaking, Gramsci takes the phenomenon of language seriously as a subject of analysis. Gramsci interprets language primarily in terms of its manifestation as a regional language and as a vernacular. It is, Gramsci argues, an element of a nouvelle intellectualisme, a historical and social reality. In a new political situation, language can acquire a significant function as a phenomenon of the superstructure. Footnote. The phonetics, the linguistic melody that characterize a specific region influence, quote, the lexicon, the morphology, and especially the syntax, end quote. Gramsci. And footnote. Footnote on the genesis of the Volkssprache, vernacular, which as a local, communal, and regional form is historically opposed to the Catholic cosmopolitan high language. See Antonio Gramsci, Die Sprachenfrage und die intellektuellen Klassen Italiens, the, quote, language question and the intellectual classes of Italy. See Jean T. Badiou, Première note sur les escrits des présents de Gramsci pour placer la littérature dans la théorie marxiste, published in the journal Dialectique, 1974. And footnote. Footnote, while written language may be national, language as a social reality is not national. By characterizing written language, let me repeat that. While written language may be national, language as a social reality is not. By characterizing it as a phenomenon of the superstructure, a turn of phrase Gramsci employs. Gramsci takes a step directed against Stalinist dictates. The unity of language Gramsci emphasizes is not a cause but an effect. In this respect, language can also serve as a means for the, quote, creation of a unified cultural, quote, climate, end quote, end quote. See Gramsci, Die Sprechweisen, Linguagia, die Sprachen, Lingua und der Alltagsverstand. Modes of speech, linguagia, languages, lingua, and common sense. In prison, in the Gefängnishefte, Prison Notebooks, Notebook 10. That Gramsci's understanding of language extends beyond nominalistic, unbridled, quote, applications becomes evident in the current debate surrounding metaphorology. See Zeitschrift für Semiotik, Volume 25, 2005, Metaphern in Bild und Film, Gestik, Theater und Musik, Metaphors in Image and Film, Gesture, Theater, and Music, and Metaphern in Sprache, Literatur und Architecture. Metaphors in language, literature, and architecture. And footnote. Back to the body. Language finds a preeminent form of expression in literature. In this regard, Gramsci outlines three perspectives for research. 1. 19th century Italian history, particularly with reference to groups of intellectuals. 2. The theory of history and historiography. And 3. Americanism and Fordism. Footnote. Originally, Gramsci had conceived of 4 projects: an investigation into Italian intellectuals, a study in comparative linguistics, a study on the theater of Pirandello, and a study on the serialized novel, Feuilleton, and popular literary taste. End footnote. The function of literature is characterized in ambivalent terms. Back to the body. The function of literature is characterized in ambivalent terms. On the one hand, it is, like religion, opium. On the other, literature is a specific expression of consciousness. Culture, it is noted, is strongly shaped by literature. However, it is to be lamented that writings in this sphere often focus on modes of thought and customs rather than on, quote, collective life, end quote. For a general discussion of the topic of the function of literature, see Helga Galois, Marxistische Literaturtheorie 1, published in 1971, as well as G. Würzberg's Kultur und Politik, der Beitrag Antonio Gramsci's zur theoretischen Grundlegung der politisch-kulturellen Transformation. I don't know how to say T's in that way. I need to learn that. Transformation Italienne, published in Italiens, 1978. And footnote. Footnote. This applies above all. What is this? Literature being a specific expression of consciousness applies above all when it constitutes a literature of the people, which does not imply, however, that it must necessarily draw upon indigenous sources. See Antonio Gramsci's Die Italienische Nationalkultur, Italian National Culture, published in Gefängnishefte, Prison Notebooks, Notebook 23, and footnote. Footnote. See Gramsci's Schriftsteller und Künstlerische Boheme, Writers and the Artistic Bohemia, in the Gefängnishefte, Prison Notebook 6. End footnote. Back to the body. Gramsci attributes particular significance to the works of Pirandello. Gramsci dedicated numerous essays and theater reviews to Luigi Pirandello, parenthesis, 1882 to 1942, in parenthesis, a writer and critic who distinguished himself academically as a stylist. To Gramsci, Pirandello's works serve as a gauge of the consciousness surrounding the development of modernity in Italy. Footnote. Pirandello, it is noted, studied in a, quote, Germany of pedantic philosophical erudition, unquote, that was deeply shaped by positivism. See Gramsci's Dialogi Pirandello's ideology in Prison Notebook 14. End footnote. The significance that Gramsci ascribes to the realm of culture is encapsulated, to borrow Kolakowski's phrasing, in the idea, quote, that the entire sphere of the, quote, superstructure constitutes a form of expressing the, quote, truly real, and, quote, aspects of social life. That is, the relations of production, end quote. Leszek Kolakowski. In a specific sense, culture presents itself as a collective consciousness. However, prior to a transformative shift in society, the, quote, cultural situation, end quote, can be understood only as a, quote, combination of the old and the new, end quote, as a, quote, momentary equilibrium, end quote, corresponding to the, quote, equilibrium of social relations, end quote. And that quote's from Zabina Kabir. This raises the question of the genesis of class consciousness, which points to the necessity of self-consciousness as a form of intellectual and moral autonomy. Footnote. The situation of class struggle, however, persists because, as Kabir argues, the concept of civil society ultimately presupposes economic equality. End footnote. Footnote. See Alberto Bergio, Gramsci und die theoretische und politische Frage des Klassenbewusstseins. Gramsci and the theoretical and political question of class consciousness. Published in Hans Heinzholz and Giuseppe Prestipino's edited volume Antonio Gramsci heute, Antonio Gramsci today. Although the proximity to Lukács is emphasized, and it is noted that a societal analysis is called for here, the premise of a consciousness in statu nascendi does not at this stage differ from the classically bourgeois conception, such as that of Kant in his essay An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment? Bergio is thus left with no choice but to point to revolution as a maieutic intervention. What the hell does that word mean? See Alberto Bergio's Gramsci und die theoretische und politische Frage des Klassenbewusstseins. Gramsci and the theoretical and political questions of class consciousness. According to AI Overview, maieutic is an adjective relating to the Socratic method of eliciting knowledge. Maieutic describes a teaching or dialogue approach where a guide asks probing questions to help a person discover, articulate, or, quote, give birth to truths and ideas that are already latent within their own mind. See Alberto Bergio, Gramsci und die theoretische und politische Frage des Klassenbewusstseins. Gramsci and the theoretical and political question of class consciousness. End footnote. Back to the body. It's worth pausing here briefly to briefly visualize this process. The culture of the oppressed, too, constitutes a part of general culture. Within culture, a, quote, catharsis of modern civilta, unquote, takes place. One which, as Gramsci emphasizes, possesses not only a, quote, depraving aspect, but also, quote, a transformative aspect, end quote. For Italy's modernity, represented by finance, capital, and by workers, quote, as producers of civilta, unquote, embodies in a specific manner something that points toward a, quote, new form of universality, end quote, Gramsci. The everyday world to which workers also belong contains, however, various distinct cultural worlds. A couple footnotes here. Quote, footnote, quote, the culture of the oppressed is a part of the national culture, and the culture of the oppressed contains the national culture's progressive conceptualizations of meaning, those left unfulfilled by the ruling class, theoretical concepts, values, and life goals, end quote. I'm not sure who that quote's from, but I think it's from Hans Heinzholz in the article Philosophische Reflexion und politische Strategie by Antonio Gramsci. Philosophical Reflection and Political Strategy in Antonio Gramsci, published in Hans Heinzholz and Giuseppe Prestipino's edited volume, Antonio Gramsci Today. The struggle for culture thus becomes a central issue. It is more of a link to the, quote, theory of hegemony, end quote. It is worth noting here that these, quote, progressive elements, end quote, are precisely those through which the bourgeoisie affirms its own bourgeois utopian components. End footnote. See footnote. See Ursula Apich's Einleitung, Otto Neurath, Antonio Gramsci, Raymond Williams, Eine verborgene Tradition. Introduction, Otto Neurath, Antonio Gramsci, Raymond Williams, A Hidden Tradition. And footnote. The, quote, spontaneous philosophy, and, quote, of the people is intended to serve as the starting point for a general cultural transformation. For common sense is regarded, this is back to the body, I should say that. The, quote, spontaneous philosophy, and, quote, of the people is intended to serve as the starting point for a general cultural transformation. For common sense is regarded as the, quote, primary theater of the struggle for hegemony, end quote. And that quote is from Zabina Kabir in the article Gramsci, Culture and Everyday Life. It is, Gramsci states, a, quote, fact that common sense in a whole series of judgments identifies matters correctly, simply and in a practically applicable manner, end quote. Gramsci. In an article titled Modes of Speech. Gramsci's concern, therefore, is with a specific conception of everyday culture, one designed to transcend certain premises of Creuset, to formulate a concept of culture specifically for the working class, and to help set in motion the means for achieving a form of proletarian self-expression. In Gramsci's conceptual framework, common sense thus becomes the, quote, center of civil society, end quote. Kabir. The influences of daily life, such as folklore, the scientific elements embedded within popular culture, the, quote, real religion, and, quote, practice regionally, and popular morality should all be subjected to equal scrutiny. For Gramsci, common sense serves as a field for experimentation. Footnote. Gramsci's conception of everyday life is above all determined by class theory, and culture is regarded as a moment in the conquest of the state. End footnote. Footnote. In doing so, Gramsci transposed Creuset's, quote, intellectual and moral reform, end quote, from a matter of high culture into one of everyday culture. He advocated early on for the conceptualization of a counterculture, and thus as early as 1917 proposed the founding of a, quote, Associazione di Cultura, while Ordine Nuovo, 1919, was initially conceived as a cultural journal based on a, quote, concept of the working class's need to catch up intellectually. The journal lost this character in the face of the struggles of the Turin workers. And I think that quote is from Sabina Kabir. I'm not sure, though. Footnote. The struggle for hegemony demands first and foremost an examination of the, quote, ideological basis of the, quote, ruling class, by which is meant the press, publishing houses, newspapers, journals, and church bulletins. See regarding civil society in general, Der Fokus der Begriff der Zivilgesellschaft by Antonio Gramsci, published in 2001. And footnote, to this extent, an empirical program becomes apparent here. And that's in reference to the line, the influences of daily life, such as folklore, the scientific elements embedded within popular culture, the, quote, real religion, practice regionally, and popular morality should all be subjected to equal scrutiny. End footnote. In the course of developing a theory of everyday culture, the analysis of, quote, good sense constitutes the logical next step. Throughout this discussion, recourse is made to the concept of ideology. The concept, situated somewhere between philosophy and everyday practice, is to be understood as, quote, in the first instance, a value-neutral concept, end quote, and as such, an integral part of culture. Footnote. This does not prevent Gramsci from emphasizing a more critical side elsewhere. A Marxist concept of ideology is not meant. End footnote. Footnote. According to Kabir, the option of prolet cult is integrated into the culturally and politically motivated alliance, even though Gramsci otherwise tends to favor a, quote, fusion of high and popular culture, end quote. Sabina Kabir. End footnote. Back to the body. The imperative, therefore, is to conceive of a new culture, one that serves on the one hand as a decisive factor in establishing a leftist hegemony, and on the other as a vital constituent element within the, quote, historical bloc, functioning as both a moral and a democratic force. Quote, to create a new culture means not only making, quote, original discoveries on an individual level. It means also and above all critically disseminating truths that have already been discovered, quote, socializing them, so to speak, and thus transforming them into the foundations of living action, into a coordinating element of intellectual and moral order, end quote. Gramsci. Footnote. Gramsci's concept of the, quote, national populaire is thought to be connected with the, quote, esprit populaire créateur, unquote. Quote, the, quote, new literature, end quote, will be the work of the, quote, revolutionary historical bloc, end quote, and in that sense, quote, of a specific struggle. The, quote, struggle for a new culture, end quote, which demands a conception of the world between writers and people, end quote. Gramsci, and I think that's by Jean T. Baudu. Gramsci connects art with morality and thus makes it an element of a historical organic development. This is reminiscent of Schiller. In that sense, the political is also involved when it comes to the struggle for a new culture, because at the same time it is also about a new way of life. End footnote. Footnote. The democratic philosopher, it is said, for example, must desire the, quote, change of the cultural environment, end quote. Gramsci. In the section, in the piece titled The Ways of Speaking, in Prison Notebooks number 10. End footnote. In Gramsci's work, the concept of culture develops in three stages. In a first period, he advocates primarily for art and culture for workers. Footnote. Accordingly, Maxim Gorky is singled out for distinction as a poet and Lunacharsky as an aesthetician, and is celebrated as the People's Commissar for Education. Gramsci highlights with praise Lunacharsky's enthusiasm for the, quote, revolutionary marionnetti. However, there is also a positive reference to Bogdanov. See Bogdanov's piece, Science and the Working Class, published in Berlin, 1920. End footnote. In a second period, an alliance with futurism is repeatedly sought. Fascinated by its activism and enthusiasm for technology, Gramsci attempts for a time to organize futurist exhibitions for workers. This attempt fails, however, because early futurism had already aligned itself politically in a predominantly different direction at an early stage. Footnote. See generally regarding futurism Manfred Hinz's book, The Future of Catastrophe, Mythical and Rationalist Theories of History in Italian Futurism, published in Berlin, New York, 1985. The revolutionary gesture and its anti-bourgeois character in the face of widespread pacifism, P-A-S-S-I-V-I-S-M, is what makes futurism of interest to Gramsci. End footnote. Footnote. The futurists had established their own terrorist group and aligned themselves with fascism. See Helga Finter's Semiotics of the Avant-Garde Text. Gesellschaftliche und poetische Erfahrungen im italienischen Futurismus. Social and poetic experiences in Italian futurism. However, the bifurcation of futurism into an early phase relevant to Gramsci and a later phase characterized by the cult of speed and subsequently appropriated by fascism, as proposed by Kabir, is problematic. For Marinetti's manifesto alone provides ample documentation of this cult. End footnote. In the third period, prolet cult moves to the foreground. In doing so, Gramsci initially links it with futurism. Elsewhere, Gramsci is found to be fascinated by Bogdanov's techtology. Thus, Gramsci also counts among the co-founders. Thus, he counts among the co-founders. Elsewhere, Gramsci is found to be fascinated by Bogdanov's techtology. Thus, Gramsci counts among the co-founders of the Turin section of prolet cult. Thereby disregarding Lenin's critical stance toward the movement. For Gramsci, his appreciation of prolet cult does not diminish the potential for alliances with intellectuals. For the primary objective remains the establishment of a cult as a popular culture. Footnote. The materials and essays on prolet cult. See the materials and essays on prolet cult in Ästhetik und Kommunikation, Beiträge zur politischen Erziehung. Aesthetics and Communication, Contributions to Political Education. Specifically, the documentation on the Proletarian Cultural Revolution, by Peter Gorzin et al. And footnote. Footnote, in order to foster the emergence of a working class culture, the present form of civilization, must first be destroyed. The futurists, it is argued, possessed, absolutely Marxist concepts, Footnote. Prolet cult and the struggle for a, alliance with intellectuals rooted in the people, are not contradictory, for, every social stratum possesses its own, everyday understanding, and its own, common sense, And I'm not sure if that's Gramsci or Sabina Kabir. End footnote. The new culture, insofar as it aims back to the body, the new culture, insofar as the new culture aims to transform the mentality of the people, also implies an altered status for philosophy. As a quote, as a Weltanschauung worldview, philosophy is intended to serve as a unifying element to which corresponding social dimensions would also align. This new culture, sometimes characterized as a quote, actualizing cultural materialism, end quote, necessarily entails the establishment of an active system of worker education. In Gramsci's conception, worker education stands in direct contrast to traditional pedagogical methods of instruction. The relationship between autonomous cultural practice and politics presents itself, in turn, as a political problem in its own right, specifically within the context of a strategic orientation toward leftist hegemony. This complex issue is explored in the section that follows. There's a number of footnotes here. According to Albers, Gramsci elucidates the mutual interdependence of, quote, revolutionary practice, scientific knowledge, and worldview, end quote. Detlef Albers. Implicit in his approach, it is suggested, is the assumption that Marxian theory has become relatively outdated. In Albers' account, Gramsci's Marxism therefore tacitly mutates from Western Marxism into a, quote, struggle for the, quote, revolution in the West, end quote, unquote. Although Gramsci's worldview is from a different quarter, simultaneously translated in a manner that transforms his original approach into a, quote, unified science, end quote, which Gramsci supposedly had in mind. His critical stance towards science is once again forgotten here. And footnote. By proceeding from the concept of, quote, collective man, a, quote, cultural social unity, end quote, is presupposed, which for Gramsci implies that many individuals ally themselves on the basis of a, quote, shared worldview, end quote, with the aim of, quote, the collective production of a unified cultural, quote, climate, end quote. Gramsci. Footnote. However, workers' education has been a traditional component of socialist practice since as early as the 19th century, e.g. workers' educational associations. Dvorak falls short of this historical horizon. See Johann Dvorak, Wissenschaftliche Weltauffassung, Marxismus und Arbeiterbildung in Wien der 20er und frühen 30er Jahre am Beispiel von Otto Neurath und Edgar Zilsel. Scientific worldview, Marxism and workers' education in Vienna in the 1920s and early 1930s, the example of Otto Neurath and Edgar Zilsel. In this work, not only does a concept of science derived from traditional Marxism blur with that of the, quote, Vienna Circle, but workers' education also becomes conflated with, quote, but workers' education also becomes conflated with Volksbildung, general adult education, in which the active element has vanished. And footnote. The situation is quite different in the case of Austro-Marxism. See Adolf Brock's Wege zum, quote, neuen Menschen. Der Einfluss des Austromarxismus auf deutsche Arbeiterkultur und Arbeiterbildung. Paths to the, quote, new man, the influence of Austro-Marxism on German workers' culture and workers' education. There, quote, workers' education is discussed against the backdrop of a strategy of economic democracy. Education, it is argued, should become a means of self-help. Parenthesis, Max Adler, in parenthesis. The new society is to be forged through education, specifically, quote, education for self-activity, end quote, and, quote, education for consciousness, end quote. Given such extensive, quote, education by party vanguards, the question must be asked repeatedly, who educates the educators? End footnote. Back to the body. In Gramsci's framework, the unifying principle, which encompasses both society and the state, assumes the following structure. The unifying principle consists of Structura economica, relations of production, and Societa civile, quote, civil society, and Societa politica, political society / the state. Footnote. Hans Heinzholz. The relationship between political and civil society proves to be, if one follows Scherer here, a blind spot, however. See Christoph Scherer, Neo-Gramscianische Interpretationen Internationaler Beziehungen, eine Kritik, in Uwe Hirschfeld's edited volume Gramsci Perspektiven. See, regarding the concept of civil society, Theo Votsos, Der Begriff der Zivilgesellschaft bei Antonio Gramsci, ein Beitrag zu Geschichte und Gegenwart politischer Theorie. End footnote. Back to the body. However, Gramsci's reflections and political options cannot be understood without taking into account the fascist usurpation of power. It is within this context, for instance, that the mafia and the Camorra are situated. Consequently, the various attempts at forming alliances, some even with political opponents, against fascism becomes comprehensible. The struggle may also be responsible for the emergence, within Gramsci's theory, of a relative, quote, state centrism, end quote, that tends to obscure actual problems. There's a couple of footnotes here. Footnote, these, what are these? So I'm going to refer to here. The Mafia and the Camorra are correctly identified as organizations of the lumpen proletariat. Quote, one mistakes an entire people for a few corrupt strata, particularly the petty bourgeoisie, end quote. Gramsci. See also, fascism is a, quote, mass organization of the petty bourgeoisie, end quote. Antonio Gramsci. On the other hand, fascism is understood as the rule of finance capital. See in this point, Christina Bucky-Glucksmann, Gramsci et l'État, pour une lecture théorico-politique des cahiers de prison. So it's something like Gramsci and the State, for a lecture, for a theoretical political reading of the prison notebooks. That's my guess at what that translates as. I have no idea. So it's probably Christine Bucky-Glucksmann. Also notes that the concept of, quote, state capitalism is not to be found in Gramsci's work, Instead, Gramsci speaks of the, quote, bloc industriel agraire, the industrial agrarian bloc. Beyond these interpretations, however, reflection also consistently returns to what Gramsci terms, quote, passive revolution. See the contemporary analysis by Rüttger. See Bernd Rüttger, Passive Revolutions, a key to understanding capitalist upheavals and the current crisis of the trade union politics. Published in Das Argument, 2007. Bernd Rüttger points out that Gramsci, proceeding from his appreciation of the factory council movement, later focuses more intently on the intensification of subalternity that accompanies passive revolutions. And footnote. Footnote. See Giuseppe Prestipino vom altmarxistischen Ökonomismus zu Gramscis Staatlichkeitsdenken. In the context of positing an intertwining of the cultural and the economic, the state is thus regarded as a, quote, instrument of rationalization, end quote, as an agent of civilization and as an educator. A designation intended to highlight the state's ethical function and upon which is imposed an anticipatory potential of civil society based on the definition of a flexible function for the, quote, superstructures to which the state is assigned. End footnote. Back to the text. Against this background, the concept of hegemony must be discussed. The, quote, superiority of a social group, end quote, manifests itself, quote, as, quote, domination and as, quote, intellectual and moral leadership, end quote, end quote. Gramsci. It is necessarily a, quote, convergence of the exercise of political power by the ruling class, ... with the general self-conception of the masses, ... end quote. Hans Heinz Holz. Beyond the superiority of a social group's genesis, I think that's what this it refers to. It says, beyond its genesis, Gramsci assigns a specific meaning to the concept of hegemony. It was, Gramsci argues, Lenin's achievement to have made possible the development of the concept of hegemony in the realms of politics and ideology. Here ethics, the conception of reality, and critical common sense converge. It is, quote, to be emphasized that the political development of the concept of hegemony represents not only a politically practical, but also a major philosophical advance, because it necessarily develops and presupposes an intellectual unity, as well as an ethics that is in conformity with a conception of reality which has transcended common sense and has become critical. End quote. Gramsci. In a first period, Gramsci advocates primarily for art and culture for workers. Oh, fuck, I fucked something up here. Scratch that last sentence. There's a number of footnotes here. The concept of hegemony is foundational for various theoretical approaches. See, by way of example, an attempt to build upon this framework, Benjamin Opratko, Hegemonie Politische Theorie nach Antonio Gramsci, published in Munster, 2012. And footnote. See also Stefan Adolphs and Serhat Karakeali, Die Aktivierung der Subalternen gegen Hegemonie und passive Revolution in Sonia Buckel and Andreas Fischer Lascano's edited volume Hegemonie gepanzert mit Zwang, Zivilgesellschaft und Politik im Staatsverständnis, Antonio Gramsci's, with an S at the end, so plural there, or possessive. And footnote. Footnote. Thus there exists a specific intertwining of force and consensus, of authority and hegemony, and of force and civilization. Footnote. Following Lo Piparo, Kabir points out that the concept was originally one of linguistic theory. This formulation, Kabir notes, was subsequently reshaped by Russian social democracy, rearticulated in a new form by Axelrod. And adopted by Lenin so as to be applicable under social democratic leadership. Since 1926, the concept of hegemony has served as the central thread running through Gramsci's work. In this context, Gramsci envisions an alliance between the working class and the peasantry of the South, an alliance incorporating elements of compromise vis-a-vis the Catholic Church, an operation under the leadership of the, quote, proletariat. Hegemony, therefore, signifies the, quote, capacity to lead and to dominate, end quote. See Luciano Gruppi's piece, abbreviated La Concept, regarding the concept of hegemony following Kramer, Sonia Buckel, and Andreas Fischer Lascano, Hegemonie im globalen Recht, sur Aktualität der Gramscianischen Rechtstheorie. In the edited volume, Hegemonie gepanzert mit Zwang, Zivilgesellschaft und Politik im Staatsverständnis Antonio Gramsci's. Hegemony, is argued, constitutes a, quote, specific way of living and thinking, a worldview upon which the preferences, tastes, morals, customs, and philosophical principles of the majority of society, end quote, are to be founded. Footnote, quote, insofar as the realization of a hegemonic apparatus creates a new ideological terrain, it affects a reform of consciousness and of methods of knowledge. It is a cognitive fact, a philosophical fact, end quote. Gramsci. Okay, so I accidentally duplicated one of these, so where am I? me see. Sorry. This is annoying to listen to. Okay, so I'm going to read the last quote from Gramsci and then moving on to the next part. So, quote, emphasized that it should be emphasized, quote, emphasized that the political development of the concept of hegemony represents not only a politically practical but also a major philosophical advance, because it necessarily develops and presupposes an intellectual unity as well as an ethics. That is in itself, not only a politically practical but also a major philosophical advance, because it necessarily develops and presupposes an intellectual unity, as well as an ethics that is in conformity to the conception of reality, which transcends common sense and has become critical. End quote. Gramsci. However, hegemony, however, initially presents itself in a traditional form, as the unchallenged position of traditional elites, and manifests its rule alongside its directly political aspect, through schools, universities, mass media, cultural institutions, and the church, that is to say, through education and cultural dominance. Gramsci's opposition to this traditional hegemony, and by extension to the class-based educational system, is thereby indicated. Nevertheless, in Gramsci's view, modern industrial labor moves to the very center of bourgeois hegemony. A new civilita emerges, constituting new conditions of life, Americanism. Yet for Gramsci, industrialism harbors the possibility of a, quote, passive revolution, end quote. This concept implies a certain passivity on the part of the masses. The passive revolution signifies state-driven modernization, accompanied by a simultaneous anti-revolutionary tendency. It is here that Gramsci directs his critique, while nonetheless seeking to preserve the utopian quality he perceives within modern America. So where am I? And there's some footnotes here. Where's the first one? Okay. Footnote. Traditional hegemony manifests itself as domination and as intellectual and moral leadership, which includes the consent of the dominated. It says, and military leadership, as Kolakowski adds. I think that's in reference to this list of things. Traditional elites directly ruling through directly political ruling. End footnote. Apich emphasizes the school as a component of state hegemony. See Ursula Apich, Antonio Gramsci, Working Class Culture. Footnote. In this respect, Gramsci arrives at an assessment of the crisis that differs from the one dominant within the Comintern, in that Gramsci seeks to conceive of the crisis not as an unstoppable law-governed decline of capitalism, but rather as a process of economic adaptation and renewal of the system, end quote. And I think that's quote, I'm not sure that quote is from, but I think that's from a piece by, I think that might be Harald Neubart. Harald Neubert. Footnote, quote, Gramsci's critique of Americanism oscillates between these two poles. On the one hand, a critique of corporatist Fordism that has made its peace with the parasitic strata of European societies, and on the other, the persistent idea of a utopian America, end quote. Ursula Apich. This critique serves simultaneously as a critique of Pirandello's anti-Americanism, yet it remains an ambivalent one itself. And footnote. Left-wing hegemony was conceived by Gramsci as an alliance of workers, peasants, the petty bourgeoisie, and intellectuals. Footnote. Actually, I'm going to hold up on the footnotes. Gramsci distinguishes between intellectuals based on their social, political, and cultural affiliations. The traditional intelligentsia is either part of the ruling classes or functions as individual practitioners in a manner conducive to the maintenance of power. The organic intelligentsia is posited in opposition to the traditional intelligentsia. Most intellectuals, however, belong to an intermediate group navigating the space between the poles of traditional and organic intellectual. Gramsci designates those intellectuals who are viewed as acting within social contexts as organic. Footnote. The envisioned alliance of workers and peasants stems from the situation of the revolutionary period of 1919 to 21. The envisioned alliance of workers and peasants strategically targets the Catholic Cooperative Campaign and the Braccianti movement. See Federico Chabod or Chabad, I don't know, Chabad, The Emergence of the New Italy from Dictatorship to Republic, published in 1961. In footnote. Footnote, quote, intellectuals develop more slowly, much more slowly than any other social group due to their nature and their historical function. They represent the entire tradition of a people. They want to summarize its entire history and synthesize it, end quote. Gramsci. This applies especially to traditional intellectuals, quote, to the old type of intellectual, end quote. Gramsci. See Gramsci, Some Aspects of the Southern Question. Unfinished treatise from autumn 1926. Manuscript in the Communist Party of Italy archives, published in Antonio Gramsci's Lo Stato Operaio in Paris, 1930. And Antonio Gramsci, La Costruzione del Partito Comunista, 1923 to 1926. And footnote. Footnote. See Antonio Gramsci, The Problem of Political Leadership in the Formation and Development of the Nation and the Modern State in Italy. Footnote. Every social group has its own organic intellectuals. The term encompasses all skilled activities. The intelligentsia includes, quote, all professional groups whose function in the social division of labor is of an organizing, administrative, and not directly physical executing nature, end quote. Gramsci. Or actually, I don't know who that quote is from. I think that might be, it might be from Detlef Albers. Here only the model of mental and manual labor applies. End footnote. End footnote. Back to the body. When it is repeatedly stated that all human beings are in principle intellectuals, this does not necessarily imply that all human beings actually perform the function of intellectual. Gramsci is therefore interested in the social function of intellectuals. According to Gramsci, democratic philosophers must consequently pose the question regarding the place of intellectuals in relation to hegemonic structures, and must grasp that the individual lives within social relations that have been culturally transformed. Intellectuals have a crucial function to perform in the service of a counter-hegemony, namely to articulate the, quote, real experiences and feelings of the masses, end quote, Gramsci, in a quasi-maieutic manner and in the elevated language of high culture, thereby helping to give voice to a working-class culture distinct from that of the bourgeoisie. Cultural hegemony is thus the, quote, precondition for the conquest of political power, end quote. Modern intellectuals should exert a certain magnetic pull upon the intellectuals, thereby formulating a distinct culture, a distinct worldview, and helping to inaugurate a specific mode of situation, a specific mode of sociality, a new société civile. For Gramsci, société civile occupies an intermediate status. For Gramsci, société civile occupies an intermediate status situated between the economy and the state. Société civile is characterized as inherently contradictory, yet ultimately remains socioeconomically determined. Mindful of the genesis of société civile and its institutions, Gramsci advocates for société civiles. It's probably actually civile, right? I don't know. That's how they say that. They say the last consonant and the last vowel in Italy, right? I don't know. Mindful of the genesis of société civile and its institutions, Gramsci advocates for société civile's radical transformation, a process that can only be achieved on the basis of a complex ideological strategy encompassing elements of enlightenment, popular movements, and a new culture. There's a number of footnotes here. Footnote: every social group has its own organic intellectuals. The term encompasses all skilled activities. The intelligentsia includes, quote, all professional groups whose function in the social division of labor is of an organizing, administrative, and not directly physical executing nature, end quote. And I think I already read that footnote. I think I might have read it. Yeah. And again, I don't know who that quote is, if that's Gramsci or Detlef Albers. Footnote. See Gramsci, The Formation of Intellectuals in Prison Notebooks 12. See Antonio Gramsci, Gli Intellettuali e Organizzazioni della Cultura, 1966, and Eugenio Garin, Politica e Cultura in Gramsci, Il problema degli intellettuali, Gramsci e la cultura contemporanea. Footnote: Gramsci writes in the letter to Tatiana on July 30th, 1931, here according to Bucky Glucksmann, that what interested Gramsci was, quote, de fixer un certain nombre d'aspects caractéristiques de l'histoire des intellectuels italiens. Intellectuel italien. This is interesting, and you want to approach the concept of budget. unquote. I don't know. Since Marx did not explain anything systematic about his understanding of the world, one must, quote, reconstruct the intellectual development in the ensemble, end quote. Gramsci. Footnote. This is implicitly directed against Mannheim's, quote, thought types. The latter had detached these types from their social context in order to subsequently attribute them to specific classes. At the same time, the concept of ideology is stretched. This process of the reciprocal attribution of ideologies to social classes, it is argued, leads to a relativization of thought qua ideology. Sie Karl Mannheim, Ideologie und Utopie. Demirović observes that Mannheim's, quote, units of practical cognitive characteristics, end quote, are ultimately also attributable to a, quote, superficial concept of the intellectual, end quote. However, because in his work the distinction between the theorist and the ideologue is imprecisely defined, and because theory frequently appears as a matter of individual opinion, he seems unable to avoid submitting it back into the general forms of knowledge characteristic of, quote, normal science, thereby returning to Mannheim's sociology of knowledge. And I'm assuming he, in that last sentence, couple of sentences, was in reference to Demirović. Footnote. Gramsci's Marxism, Kolakowski judges, is, quote, as it were, a synthesis of humanism and the Reformation, end quote. Leszek Kolakowski. And footnote. Footnote. Since they are for the most part employees of the ruling class, quote, functionaries of the superstructure, end quote, producers of worldviews and mediators of domination, it's precisely this position that enables them to help construct a new progressive hegemony. And that's in reference to modern intellectuals. End footnote. Back to the body. The question regarding a more explicit formulation of what constitutes the actual content of ideology had already emerged, albeit in nascent form, during the early stages of Gramsci's articulation of the, quote, philosophy of praxis, end quote. In that context, Gramsci notably critiqued a deterministic conception of the relationship between base and superstructure, pointing out that the latter serves simultaneously as an expression of history and as a form of consciousness of history. Base and superstructure conceived as a, quote, concrete totality, end quote, find their expression in the bloco storico, historical block, precisely because the superstructure possesses its own objective reality. Base and superstructure are, in this sense, quote, parts of an organic whole, end quote. It is the Weltanschauung worldview that guarantees ideological unity across class lines. Where am I? Sorry, I gotta find. I think this last paragraph that I read, the footnotes didn't come through. So let's see. Yes, that is the case. So where should I be at now? Okay, I think I know where I'm at. Footnote, see Sabina Kabir, Gramsci's Begriff der, quote, bürgerlichen Gesellschaft, Entstehungsgeschichte und Aktualität, Gramsci's concept of, quote, civil society, genesis, and contemporary relevance, published in 1985. And footnote. Footnote. It constitutes the lowest tier of the superstructure. And what does? I'm not sure, actually. Whatever it is. It constitutes the lowest sphere of the superstructure and encompasses all private organizations, while the upper tier is formed by Societa Politica, the state. See Annegret Kramer's piece, abbreviated Gramsci's interpretation. According to Kabir, I'm guessing that this is Societa Civile. According to Kabir, it serves as synonym for culture, for a, quote, non-state, quote, public sphere distinct from the state. Following Labriola, a distinction is drawn, and a, quote, historically novel functional nexus among the three levels, base, civil society, and state, is, end quote, is identified. And I believe that's Sabir. Quote, situated between the economic base and the state, with its legislation and its apparatus of coercion, stands, quote, civil society, end quote, end quote. Sabina Kabir. See also the reductionist view presented by Zonia Buckle and Andreas Fischer Lescano in the piece abbreviated Hegemony. And footnote. Footnote. While it serves as the site of hegemony, insofar as ideology occupies a distinct space within it, this hegemony is conceived as fundamentally social in nature, as it is subject to the mechanism by which subaltern classes are integrated into the sphere of the dominant classes. Ultimately, the balance of power between the classes is the decisive factor here. Regarding the problem of ideology politically, see Romano Duperini, Gli intellettuali di sinistra e ideologia della ricostruzione nel dopoguerra. Published in Rome, 1971. Generally, German Perez, Gramsci's Theorie der Ideologie, published in Frankfurt, 1979. See Richard Zorg, Ideologie, Theorie zum Verhältnis von gesellschaftlichem Bewusstsein und sozialer Realität, published in Cologne, 1976, and regarding Gramscian ideology in general, Jan Rehmann, Einführung in die Ideologie-Theorie, published in Hamburg, 2008. However, as might be objected here, the task at hand is to transcend the ethico-mechanical theory of class. End footnote. Footnote. Here, Gramsci was primarily interested in the, quote, historical conditions of development, end quote, encompassing parliamentarism and culture, and the, quote, interconnections of economy, state, and superstructure, end quote. Zabina Kabir. Footnote. Falling under this category as, quote, private organizations, end quote, are the church, schools, libraries, architecture, the press, circles, clubs, and trade unions. End footnote. Footnote. Enlightenment must build upon common sense and the, quote, national cultural tradition, end quote. Gramsci. From Notes sur Machiavelli. Footnote. Quote, the philosophy of Praxis does not treat base and superstructure as moments, quote, detached from one another. Rather, the philosophy of Praxis conceives of base and superstructure's developments as intimamente connesso, intimately connected, and, quote, necessarily interrelated and reciprocal, end quote. Gramsci. End footnote. Footnote. In this context, according to Kramer, Gramsci points out that ideology is not, quote, mere illusion, but rather as a, quote, phenomenon. It is a quote, expression of real social relations, end quote. Gramsci. However, actually, I suppose that's, I don't know actually if that quote is from Gramsci or Kramer. However, since Gramsci simultaneously transformed the Marxian concept of ideology, the statement remains unspecified. End footnote. Footnote. As an ideology, it is concluded, by analogy with the institution of the Catholic Church, it possesses a material structure. End footnote. Okay, so I think we're caught back up. When base and this is back to the body, when base and superstructure are conceived in conjunction, that is, as a unified entity, Gramsci designates this concept as the, quote, historical block, end quote. Embedded within this historical block is a specific form of hegemony, and by extension, the recognition of the distinct interest of the various groups involved. Footnote. Quote, the base and superstructure form a, quote, historical block. That is, the complex and heterogeneous ensemble of superstructures is a reflection of the ensemble of social conditions of production. It follows from this that only a complete system of ideologies rationally reflects the contradictions of the base and represents the existence of objective conditions for the transformation of practice, end quote. Gramsci. End footnote. Back to the body. From this point, we must return once again to Gramsci's conception of hegemony. The focus now shifts to the concept of proletarian hegemony. This is envisioned as a specific coalition and alliance of diverse groups operating under the leadership of the proletariat. This alliance is also expected to emerge spontaneously. Gramsci's conception of this alliance also entails political party demarcations, specifically, among others, vis-a-vis Trotsky. Hegemony thus appears as the very form through which such alliances are realized. The proletariat's capacity for leadership is deemed possible precisely because the proletariat's power is inextricably linked to that of the international. organization. The political party, by contrast, is viewed as a mere reflection of societa civile. The path toward proletarian hegemony is not, however, free of conflict. Conversely, Gramsci issues warnings against bureaucracy, elitism, and a lack of democratic practice. The significance of the concept of hegemony lies in its theoretical implications regarding the state, and if one follows Kolakowski on this point, in its economic dimension. How far do I have to go? Footnote. See Harald Neubert's Theoretische Erkenntnisse Lenins und Gramsci's über die Hegemonie der Arbeiterklasse und der Kampf der Kommunisten in den kapitalistischen Ländern. Theoretical Insights of Lenin and Gramsci on the Hegemony of the Working Class and the Struggle of Communist and Capitalist Countries. Published in 1982. See Luciano Gruppi, Il Concetto di Egemonia in Gramsci. Guessing that's the concept of hegemony. Gramsci's concept of hegemony. Giuseppe Tamburano, Gramsci e la Gramsci e l'egemonia in Studi Gramsciani, Rome, 1958, and Gwyn A. Williams, The Concept of Hegemonia in the Thought of Antonio Gramsci, published in the Journal of the History of Ideas, 1960. And footnote. Contrary to the assumptions of Renan and Zorel, Gramsci seeks to wrest intellectuals away from reformism and endow their function with new value. The, quote, hegemonic capacity of the proletariat constitutes the precondition for an alliance between intellectuals and the working class world. At the same time, it prevents the intellectuals from falling into corporatism. See Ernest Renan, La réforme intellectuelle et morale. See Georges Sorel, Le système historique de Renan. In Gramsci's view, intellectuals are socially integrated into this, quote, new hegemony insofar as they become the recipients of a new, quote, cultural demand, end quote. Footnote. Gramsci, as Kolakowski notes, advocates a broad alliance from the very beginning. And footnote. Footnote. By, quote, spontaneity, what is understood is spontaneous consensus. See Sabina Kabir, Gramsci's Civil Gesellschaft. Gramsci's Civil Society. End footnote. Footnote. The concept of hegemony is intended to problematize two paths that in Gramsci's view are erroneous. Economistic concepts and the, quote, theory of permanent revolution. The theory of permanent revolution, Gramsci argues, undermines the role of the party as an active element. See Harald Neubert, Sum Partei Concept, Antonio Gramsci's, which I guess is Antonio Gramsci's conception of the party. Published in, I don't know. Since 1926, This anti-Trotskyist stance is stemmed from the idea of a worker-peasant alliance. Gramsci's critique of Trotsky is thus motivated by a desire to preserve party unity at all costs, thereby ensuring that its capacity for action is maintained. However, Gramsci could have recognized that the ban on factions historically preceded the Jacobin terror, and furthermore, that if the movement were not to lose the vitality upon which he placed such importance, the principles of workers' democracy would need to be reflected within its central institutions. End footnote. Footnote, quote, the proletariat can become the leading and ruling class only insofar as it succeeds in establishing a system of class alliances that enables it to mobilize the majority of the working population against capitalism and the bourgeois state, end quote. Gramsci. In Some Aspects of the Southern Question. Translate, or in German, einige Gesichtspunkte der Frage des Südens. Footnote. See Nicola Badaloni, Gramsci, From Liberalism to Revolutionary Communism. Footnote. The struggle must be waged on economic, political, and ideological fronts. End footnote. Footnote. In 1923, Gramsci spoke out against bureaucratism and elitist detachment. See Harold Neubert's Sum Partei concept. In 1926, Gramsci called for, quote, tolerant interaction among representatives of differing views within the party, end quote. Quote, intra-party democracy, end quote, internationalism, end quote. Footnote, quote, one of Gramsci's major achievements in political theory lies in the expansion of the concept of the state through the theory of hegemony, thereby opening up the perspective of a theory of politics and culture, end quote. Uwe Hirschfeld. Uwe Hirschfeld. In Intellektuelle Kritik und soziale Arbeit, Definitionsversuche in Auseinandersetzung mit Walzer und Gramsci, Intellectuals' Critique in Social Work, Attempts at Definition in Engagement with Walzer and Gramsci. This presupposes that prior to this and beyond Engels' characterization of the state as a, quote, general committee, unquote, a Marxist theory of the state had already existed. Even the young Gramsci employs a simple model with regard to the, quote, bourgeois state, unquote. Quote, in the dialectics of ideas, anarchy continues liberalism, end quote. The proletarian state, Gramsci argues, is to be distinguished from this. See Antonio Gramsci, Der Staat und der Sozialismus, The State and Socialism, published in L'Ordine Nuovo, June 28th to July 5th, 1919, Volume 1, Number 8, in Antonio Gramsci, L'Ordine Nuovo, 1919 bis 1920. Footnote. See Hans-Jürgen Bieling, Frank Deppe, Gramscianismus in der internationalen politischen Ökonomie, Gramscianism in International Political Economy, published in Das Argument, 1996. Oh, I've gone too far. Okay. Where am I? The latter aspect now appears to be of particular interest. Economic questions are, of course, a matter of course within Marx's discourse. Thus, in Gramsci's work, the economy often enters the discussion in the form of, quote, simple data, end quote. Wage levels, average incomes, tax rates, price indices, and the cost of living. As Kabir notes, Gramsci frequently grappled with economic questions, for instance, in the context of the, quote, Sardinian question, the plight of southern Italy, the phenomenon of colonialism, and the issue of economic hierarchies. Capitalism remains a constant thematic presence throughout his work. Quote, thus does capitalism exercise its exploitation and its domination within the factory, directly over the working class and within the state, over the broadest strata of the Italian working people, a populace comprising poor peasants and semi-proletarians. Gramsci. From the Livorno Party Congress, 1921. Gramsci proceeds from the unity of politics and economics, which also serves as the starting point for Gramsci's critique of economism and is intended to function as a, quote, instrument for the analysis of the crisis of capitalism, end quote. In discussions regarding Gramsci's engagement with economics, reference is often made to his contact and correspondence with Sraffa in order to emphasize that he devoted serious effort to economic questions. Gramsci wishes for the critique of political economy to be understood as a critical economics. Gramsci's specific concept of modern economics places the commodity and the market, conceived as structural categories, at its very center. The state, acting as an economic agent, is likewise subsumed under the category of economics. On several occasions, Gramsci asked Sraffa whether he might be able to procure literature for him concerning the, quote, philosophical significance, end quote, of Ricardo. Gramsci is convinced of the importance of Ricardo's positions and his particular mode of theorizing, and shares several of these views himself. In this respect, and because Gramsci conceives of, quote, critical economics in historical terms, Gramsci also takes an interest in the, quote, economic doctrines, end quote, that preceded Marx. Marx's oeuvre itself appears to Gramsci as an improved version of Ricardo. It becomes evident that the distinction between classical economics and the critique of political economy remains somewhat unclear to Gramsci. Gramsci's hopes are directed toward a new reception of the critique of political economy, a pursuit that reveals itself above all as a quest. This is manifested in Gramsci's call for a textbook on, quote, critical economics that would encompass all of Marx's economic writings. Furthermore, such a textbook would need to incorporate the history of theoretical economics and expound upon fundamental philosophical positions. It is within this context that a recourse to the philosophy of Ricardo would find its true significance. Okay, number of footnotes here. And what's the last one? Let's see. Where do I need to stop? Okay. Where am I? Where do I need to stop and where do I need to start? That's the question. Footnote. For the most part, these problems are situated within an ethical practical context. And footnote. Footnote, the critique of economism, which has already been addressed on various occasions, as well as on as many of the problems alluded to, are found scattered throughout the writings. See the summary in Antonio Gramsci, Scritti di Economia Politica. Above all, Bucky Glucksmann emphasizes, Gramsci is concerned with the understanding of de la réalité sociale. De la réalité sociale, of social reality. See Christine, Bucky Glucksmann, Gramsci et l'État, Gramsci and the State. And footnote. Footnote, the critique is directed primarily A, against Italian syndicalism, and B, against vulgar economism. C, regarding the latter, I. A. Lapidus and K. W. Ostrovityanov, Grundrisse der politischen Ökonomie, politische Ökonomie und Theorie der Sowjetökonomie, Outline of Political Economy and Theory of the Soviet Economy, published in 2 volumes, Moscow, 1926. And footnote. Footnote, the regulation theory, like the as in like the school, draws upon Gramsci. There, however, the base superstructure schema is elevated to the status of a theorem, specifically the, quote, dialectic of accumulation regimes and modes of production of regulation, end quote, thereby becoming the immanent structure of capital and the state. See Heinz Jung, Der Postrealsozialistische Kapitalismus, zu den neuen Anforderungen an marxistischer Kapitalismus analyzing. In Frank Deppe et al. Eckpunkte moderner Kapitalismus Kritik. And footnote. Footnote. See by way of example, Jean-Pierre Potier, Un économiste non-conformiste, Piero Sraffa, published in Lyon, 1987, Michael R. Kretka, Antonio Gramsci's Beiträge zu einer kritischen Ökonomie, published in Uwe Hirschfeld's edited volume, Apich and Kammerer point to the broader scope of this discussion. See Ursula Apich and Peter Kammerer's Intellektuelle Transformismus Subalternität zur Kommunikation zwischen Antonio Gramsci, Tatiana Schucht und Pierre Sraffa, 1931 to 1935, published in Das Argument, 306, published in 2014. Gramsci's correspondence with Sraffa touches upon Croce, Dante, and aesthetics, as well as politics and the philosophy of praxis. With Schucht, however, it focuses on psychoanalysis. It seems evident that even in the realm of economics, Gramsci tends to orient himself more toward the philosophy of culture and history, an approach through which he interprets economic matters politically. Footnote. In this respect, the perspective adopted by Ernesto Laclau, Maria Macciocchi, and Chantal Mouffe, and Nikos Palantzis, namely that Gramsci's work constitutes primarily a critique of economism intended to restore the primacy of politics, is misguided. See, by way of example, Maria Macciocchi, Pour Gramsci, published in 1974 in Paris, and the General Critique by Kretka, Michal Kretka, Antonio Gramsci's Beiträge zu einer kritischen Ökonomie, published in Amsterdam, 1997. And footnote. Footnote, implicit within it, the, quote, philosophy of praxis, quote, is embedded. For Gramsci, it serves as a research program grounded in historical and empirical realities. Footnote. To Gramsci, Marxian economics and classical economics appear as a unity. Quote, behind the specific abstraction of the specific market, there thus lies an implicit theory of the state, a, quote, theory of the state as an economic actor, end quote, which Gramsci believes he can find primarily in Ricardo, end quote. See Michal Kretka, Antonio Gramsci's contributions to critical economics. Footnote. In this respect, Gramsci also hopes that a critical discussion might develop after the publication of the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe 1, the Mega 1, after the publication of Mega 1 began in the 1920s. And footnote. Footnote. In this respect, however, attempts to build on Gramsci in order to proceed to an analysis of post-Fordism are problematic from the outset. See Eustache Kouvelakis, Le Post-Fordisme, une lecture à partir de Gramsci et de Foucault, in Actuelle Marx Confrontation, L'Ordre Capitaliste. L'Ordre Capitaliste? I don't know. Shit, where am I? Back to the body. Against the backdrop of this excursus on Gramsci's engagement with economic theory, we must now return to his political theory. Footnote. For an introduction, see Jean-Marc Piot's La pensée politique de Gramsci, published in Paris, 1970, Ernesto Ragionieri, Die politische Konzeption Gramscis, published in Marxistische Blätter, 1968, see Ulrich Schreiber, Die politische Theorie Antonio Gramsci's, and regarding connections, Pietro Ingrao, Elemente einer neuen Logik linker Politik, in Das Argument, 1982. End footnote. Back to the body. The Factory Council movement of 1919 profoundly influenced Gramsci's theoretical work. For Gramsci, the Factory Council movement remains one of the key reference points of political thought. As Gramsci maintains, the objective is to establish workers' democracy within both society and the state. According to Gramsci, the workers' councils proved to be the optimal vehicle for fostering general consciousness raising as well. They are called upon, he asserts, quote, to organize the entirety of social life, end quote. Gramsci. As Kolakowski notes, Gramsci clearly and emphatically insists upon the dependence of political organization on the workers. The factory councils are to be regarded as the new form of social life. Within the structure of workers' organizations, Gramsci attaches particular importance to the commissions, serving, as it were, as the lowest level organizational units, viewing them as organs of self-administration. Footnote, quote, the working class is a national and international class. It must place itself at the head of the working people, who are fighting to free themselves on both national and international levels from the yoke of industrial and financial capitalism, end quote. Gramsci at the Livorno Party Congress, published in L'Ordine Nuovo, January 13th, 1921. And footnote, it is necessary, quote, to create a genuine workers' democracy now, in effective and active opposition to the bourgeois state, parenthesis, sick, exclamation point, and parenthesis, end quote, Gramsci. Where am I? The energies that became visible in 1919 should be channeled to, quote, make an organized society, end quote, Gramsci, with self-education, the accumulation of experience, and a sense of responsibility regarding future studies. To me. Fuck that up. I got distracted. Bugs out here. The energies that became visible in 1919 should be channeled to, quote, make an organized society, quote, with self-education, the accumulation of experience, and a sense of responsibility regarding future duties. And footnote. Footnote, quote, the councils therefore constitute for Gramsci the best way to facilitate the formation of a universal conscience among the proletariat, end quote. Nicola Badaloni, Gramsci. Sorry, I'm getting distracted here. Quote, the councils therefore constitute for Gramsci the best way to facilitate the formation of a universal conscience among the proletariat, end quote. Nicola Badaloni. Footnote, and this is a quote, and it's in French, so I'm gonna, fuck it up. Les new institutions représentatives des producteurs ont des fonctions de direction qui concernent l'ensemble de la vie sociale italienne et plus particulièrement les paysans. Nicola Badaloni. For Gramsci, the internal factory commissions, alongside socialist clubs and peasant communities, serve as, quote, organs of workers' democracy, end quote, and, quote, centers of proletarian life, end quote, Gramsci. And footnote. Back to the text. A further stage in this envisioned system of self-administration is presented by the factory committees, which are to be complemented by city committees. It is thus already evident that these forms of workers' democracy, what these forms of workers' democracy are designed to achieve. They aim for a council rule. If Gramsci grounded his argumentation in a representative system based on councils, then, as Kolakowski correctly observes, this constitutes the, quote, ideological germ of an alternative communism, end quote, Kolakowski. Footnote. See Leszek Kolakowski. However, as Kolakowski clarifies, this is with the party acting as a pedagogical instrument and as an organizer. This point is discussed in detail at the end of this section. End footnote. Back to the body. The work of the commissions and the movement of the workers feed into a process that, for Gramsci, implies both the, quote, political opportunity, and, quote, for a proletarian revolution and the, quote, intellectual liberation of the working masses, end quote. Gramsci. Footnote. Within the framework of the concept of hegemony, the focus is placed on the intellectual and moral revolution of the masses. This is considered to be part of, quote, démocratie populaire. See Massimo Salvadori, Actualité de Gramsci, translated by Jean Vivier in the journal Dialectique in Paris, 1974. And footnote. Back to the text. To the extent that the masses appropriated Marxism, the masses would become a, quote, revolutionary force, end quote. Force revolutionnaire. Revolution, therefore, signifies the, quote, beginning of a, quote, regulated society, end quote. Parenthesis, società regolata, end parenthesis. Yet even the Italian Revolution, too, could only be part of a broader general movement. This process is intended to be one driven by conscious intent. Footnote. Within the framework of the concept of hegemony, the focus is placed... Sorry, I already said that. Footnote. See the contemporary reference. Karl Radek, Die Diktatur des Proletariats, Die Entwicklung des Sozialismus von der Wissenschaft zur Tat, The Dictatorship of the Proletariat, The Development of Socialism from Science to Action, published in Essen, 1918. End footnote. Back to the body. Quote, the element of, quote, spontaneity, end quote, is insufficient for the revolutionary struggle. The element of spontaneity never leads the working class beyond the confines of the current bourgeois democracy. For that, the element of consciousness is necessary. End quote. Gramsci. Footnote. Also unmistakable here are the borrowings from Kautsky and from Lenin's theory of party building. End footnote. Back to the body. Revolutionary practice implies unity and alliance, yet Gramsci simultaneously emphasizes the autonomy of the working class. The revolution, it is stipulated, cannot be mere seizure of political power as a central component, it must entail the assumption of socioeconomic power, which is possible only with the guidance of a revolutionary party. However, revolution is also to be understood as a historical process of collective self-enlightenment. In political terms, a schematic of distinct phases is thus outlined. Quote, the first is the struggle for democratic freedoms, within which the proletariat can organize itself, and the second aims at the creation of alliances among all potentially, quote, anti-capitalist, quote, all potentially, quote, anti-capitalist forces, end quote. And the third phase should ultimately culminate in the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, end quote. I'm not sure that last quote is from, if that's from Kabir or Gramsci. Number of footnotes here. Footnote: revolutionary practice is held to be the synthesis between the quote lutte des classes (bracket class struggle) end bracket, and a quote méthode d'investigation scientifique (bracket method of scientific investigation) end bracket. And footnote. Footnote: although Gramsci consistently makes clear his specific focus on Italy, he simultaneously presents himself as a supporter of the Third International. In this regard, see Sophie G. Auf, Leitfaden Italien, vom antifaschistischen Kampf zum historischen Kompromiss, Guide to Italy from the Anti-Fascist Struggle to the Historic Compromise, published in Berlin, 1977. There must exist a, quote, mouvement unitaire, quote, unitary movement, conceived as a, quote, ensemble de forces sociales, aggregate of social forces, capable of presenting itself as a bloc social bloc. Consequently, the revolution can be nothing other than, quote, les produits d'une alliance entre les ouvriers du Nord et les paysans notamment du Sud. The product of an alliance between the workers of the North and the peasants, particularly those of the South. This alliance is to be led by the industrial working class and is to entail un nouveau rapport entre les masses laborieuses et les intellectuels, a relationship between the laboring masses and the intellectuals. Footnote: see Kabir. Kabir also notes that Gramsci recognized early on, quote, that the coup-like triggering of a socialist revolution was not possible in Western European countries, end quote. Zabina Kabir. Footnote. See Nicola Badaloni. Quote, the possibility for the structure of the entraîné, parenthesis, Coin Volta, and parenthesis, in the history, this is the development of the idea of the council, or justification of the principal force, productively capable of speaking to the first person. In the new conditions, the prince of modernity represents the same thing as the problem of historization of reality at the level of economy, end quote. Nicola Badaloni. End footnote. Back to the body. However, this schematic of phases also entails a recentering of what is to be regarded as the determinant of the revolutionary process, a strategy of revolutionary reformism. Footnote, quote, Perry Anderson has reminded us that these reflections of Gramsci's on the social changes since 1848 had a predecessor, both in the meaning and in their metaphor borrowed from military thought, to which Gramsci, however, makes no direct reference. An article by Kautsky from 1910. Kautsky transferred Hans Delbrück's military concepts of attrition and subjugation to the class struggle of the working class. End quote. Zabina Kabir. The new social strategy is that of the struggle for electoral victories. And footnote. Footnote. Kabir polemicizes vehemently against Luxemburg's critique of Kautsky, which saw reformism in action here. Kabir discusses the logical consequences in Gramsci. Gramsci logically replaces the concept of revolution with the terms, quote, overthrow of practice, end quote, creation of the state, end quote, struggle for the, quote, possession of the state, end quote. Haug sees a strategic element primarily in the concept of, quote, passive revolution, end quote. Quote, just as surfers must try to ride the crest of the wave to avoid being swallowed by it, the art of practical dialectics revolves around not being overwhelmed by contradictions, but perhaps even transforming contradictions into targeted forces of action, end quote. Wolfgang Fritz Haug, on the Dialectic of Anti-Capitalism, published in Das Argument 2007. The challenge, therefore, is to avoid contradictions, to tame the wave, and to transform the wave into targeted power. But what is the wave? Is Haug a surfer of capitalism or of the zeitgeist? End footnote. Back to the body. Any examination of Gramsci's conception of the party must necessarily first address the problem of Jacobinism. At that time, Gramsci had rejected Jacobinism and along with it Rousseau's theory of the social contract, while lauding the Russian Revolution as a counter-model. The question of Jacobinism was taken up once again starting in 1921, influenced by the work of Albert Mathiez, who had emphasized the parallels between the French and Russian revolutions. With regard to the agrarian question, a shift occurred in Gramsci's thinking, a return to the Jacobin model. And there's a number of footnotes here. Footnote C. Generally, Luciano Gruppi, La Teoria del Partito Rivoluzionario, published in Rome, 1980. Footnote. During the phase of his work on Il Grido del Popolo, 1917 to 1918, Gramsci had still characterized Jacobinism as a faction compliant with the bourgeoisie. See Hugues Portelli, Jacobinism, and the first chapter of this study. And footnote. Footnote. See Hugues Portelli, Jacobinism. Dora Kaplan, the assassin of Lenin, was elevated to the status of a true Jacobin. Jacobinism was described as the, quote, utopian ideology of fanatics, end quote. Gramsci. Footnote, quote, the Jacobin origin of the policy of alliance of the peasantry is therefore acknowledged, end quote. End footnote. Back to the body. Jacobinism is now defined in a dual sense. Firstly, through its social content, which serves as the foundation for a political alliance of the popular masses, and secondly, as a cultural revolution involving a, quote, intellectual and moral reform, end quote. Reform intellectuelle et morale. The Bolsheviks are now regarded as the new Jacobins. The relationship between the party and the people is now conceived as analogous to that between intellectuals and the masses, much as it was in the thought of Kautsky and Lenin. Gramsci's Jacobinism thus remains underdetermined and ambivalent. Gramsci's Jacobinism, it remains to be seen to what extent Gramsci's theory of the party resolves the problem of Jacobinism. Footnote: the Bolsheviks are the, quote, proletarian incarnation of Jacobinism, end quote. Incarnation prolétarienne du Jacobinisme. In this respect, a position critical of Trotsky is adopted, as Trotsky is seen as neglecting the peasantry. The Italy of 1927 is situated in a similar context. The PCI is the, quote, Italian incarnation of proletarian Jacobinism, end quote. Incarnation italienne du Jacobinisme prolétarien. The PCI's task is to ensure the political and ideological unity of the lower classes. Thus, in relation to the working class, the PCI acts as the, quote, organic intellectual, end quote, and in relation to hegemony as the, quote, national intellectual, end quote. Footnote: with regard to the proposed axis of Machiavelli, Lenin, Gramsci, Depa points out that the question of democracy was underestimated. And footnote. Portelli writes, at its core, Gramsci's Jacobinism is a, quote, hybrid category, end quote. Catégorie hybride. It encompasses the concept of the, quote, national popular, end quote, alongside a simultaneous, quote, bourgeois revolution and socialist revolution, end quote. Révolution bourgeoise et révolution socialiste. End footnote. Back to the body. The Socialist Party, as it was articulated early on, is placed in a specific relationship to the workers' democracy of the commissions and councils. The Socialist Party is positioned above them. The Socialist Party must, quote, continue to be the organ of communist education, the heart of faith, the guardian of theory, the supreme power that harmonizes the unorganized and organized forces of the working and peasant classes and leads them toward their goal, end quote. Gramsci. The party is regarded as the, quote, nomenclature of the class, end quote. The party is part of the international. According to Gramsci, the party possesses a constitutive function, a function which remains at least partially open to the movement of the class. For Gramsci, Lenin is the true theorist of a philosophy of praxis. This explains the fact that at various intervals, Gramsci strove to align himself with Leninist positions. According to Kabir, Gramsci was led to this stance by his conviction that it was insufficient for the proletariat merely to oppose the war. Rather, in times of crisis, it had to actively pursue its own distinct objectives. Thus, in the course of this alignment, Gramsci participated in the meetings of the anti-war left in Lugano, 1914, as well as in the conferences held in Simmerwald, 1915, and Kiental, 1916. In the scholarly reception of his work, Gramsci is largely regarded as a committed Leninist. Footnote. There's a number of footnotes here. Although it is emphasized that trade unions and the party are not, quote, identical with the proletarian state, end quote, the party is accorded a superior special status. And footnote, the prerequisite for this, it is argued, must be the, quote, stabilisation Leniniste du parti, the Leninist stabilization of the party. Nicola Badaloni. Footnote. One could say, Gramsci suggests, quote, that parties are the products of new, integral, and holistic forms of intellectuality. That is, the melting pots for the unification of theory and practice, understood as a genuine historical process, end quote. Gramsci. Prison Notebooks 11. Footnote. Although his conception regarding the function of leadership differs little from the Leninist concept, he remains, as Neubert emphasizes, more open to the dynamic elements of the class movement itself. And footnote. Footnote. Gramsci shares with Kautsky and Lenin the view that the party must educate the working class. However, Gramsci qualifies this position with several modifications, specifically concerning the, quote, Southern question. Parenthesis, the problem of Southern Italy, in parenthesis. Footnote. See Guido Zamis Nachwort and Palmiro Tagliati, Der Leninismus. Gramsci is credited with playing the leading role in the struggle for the, quote, Bolshevization of the PCI during the period from 1923 to 1926. See Guido Neubert points out the significant distance from Stalin. For in Gramsci's view, quote, historical understanding, partisan political engagement, political action, and theory constitute a unity, end quote. Gramsci. Or, Harold Neubert. And footnote, back to the body. However, this view, with its one-sided emphasis, is imprecise, as others have pointed out. Gramsci actually presents a modified form of Leninism. Footnote, Tagliati, as Kolakowski notes at one point, regards Gramsci's theory more as a supplement to Leninism. Badaloni goes further, viewing Gramscian theory more as an enrichment. And footnote. Back to the body. This is further evidenced by Gramsci's ability to recognize and address the problem of bureaucratism. Against the backdrop of Gramsci's critique of bureaucracy, Gramsci develops a nuanced form of centralism. Gramsci distinguishes between bureaucratic, organic, and democratic centralism. Gramsci himself favors the organic model. That's interesting because you usually often hear organic centralism being associated, or at least that term being used by Bordigas. Gramsci distinguishes between bureaucratic, organic, and democratic centralism. Gramsci himself favors the organic model, which he argues can only exist in a democratic form, and which signifies a, quote, constant adaptation to the real movement, end quote. Gramsci, thereby pointing to the necessity of responding to historical change. On the other hand, however, one cannot overlook an exceedingly strong emphasis on centralism in Gramsci's work. While Gramsci notes that the party is a part of the class and a unifying element, at the same time a pervasive Marxism-Leninism, with its apologia for centralism and hierarchy, remains dominant. The party, Gramsci argues, must constitute a, quote, homogeneous bloc, end quote, and an ideological unity. Above all else, the imperative is to preserve the unity of the party. This stance then serves to legitimize a struggle against those forces perceived as threatening that unity, specifically Bordiga's radical leftism, Trotsky's positions, and Rosa Luxemburg's critiques, for in his view, all factionalism appears to be the work of provocateurs. Footnote: as early as 1923, Gramsci spoke out against bureaucratism and the elitist tendency towards self-autonomization. Albers draws attention to the conservatism of the bureaucracy, emphasizing that bureaucratism is a repressive form. Footnote: one also finds a hypercentralism, particularly in the context of his disputes with Bordiga and Trotsky, which itself complicates his engagement with the Missi Domini, parenthesis, ECCI, in parenthesis. Footnote: see Antonio Gramsci, The Situation Within Our Party and the Tasks of the Next Party Congress, speech before the Central Committee of the PCI on May 11th to 12th, 1925. And footnote. See Antonio Gramsci, 5 Years in the Life of the Party, report on the results of the Third Congress of the PCI in La Unita, February 24th, 1926, Volume 3, Number 47. Footnote. In his 1926 letter to Togliatti, Gramsci had warned the Central Committee of the Comintern against excessive radicalism in the exercise of power, particularly vis-a-vis the opposition. By 1929, at the latest, in the light of the new tactic of, quote, fighting against social fascism, and, quote, Gramsci's cautious stance and his adherence to the United Front tactic themselves came to be viewed as bordering on oppositionism. Moreover, Gramsci's standing did not prevent him from being accused of Trotskyism, this despite the fact that Gramsci had been in prison since 1926. In this respect, the expulsion of numerous founding members of the PCI, parenthesis, Tosca, Bordiga, Silone, Leonetti, in parenthesis, can hardly have met with his approval. See Ursula Apich and Peter Kammerer's article, Was geschieht mit den Besiegten? Die Biografie Antonio Gramscis aus der Sicht der Gefängnisbriefe, published in Das Argument, 2007. Where am I? Footnote: the refusal to undergo, quote, Bolshevization, parenthesis, from 1925 onwards, in parenthesis, was ultimately a nationally parochial attitude. And footnote. Footnote: at one moment, I'm guessing this is related to Luxembourg. At one moment, she is reproached for having underestimated will and organization. At another, she is criticizing for having ignored positional warfare and alliance politics. In short, for having behaved in a manner detrimental to the party avant la lettre. See Antonio Gramsci, Politischer Kampf und Militarische Auseinandersetzung, Political Struggle and Military Confrontation, published in Notebook 13, Prison Notebook 13. Here then, Luxemburg's own critique of bureaucracy is once again forgotten. End footnote. Back to the body. The construction of party unity as an element of a subject in the process of becoming political is somewhat illuminated when one considers the perspective from which Gramsci, for instance, discusses Machiavelli. Footnote. See also the designation of the task of communism, the salvation of the nation. End footnote. Back to the body. Political theory, particularly in its relation to the problem of the state, emerges as a central theme in the passages concerning Machiavelli. Machiavelli is interpreted somewhat pointedly as a populist. Machiavelli is viewed as someone who, in The Prince, gave expression to the relationship between leadership and the people, and whose political philosophy constitutes a theory of the state sui generis. Quote, the utopian character of the Prince lies in the fact that the Prince did not exist in historical reality, nor did the Prince present himself to the Italian people with traits of objective immediacy. Rather, he was a purely theoretical abstraction, the symbol of the leader, the ideal condottiere. End quote. Machiavelli, it is argued, concerned himself with, quote, what the Prince must be like in order to lead a people toward the founding of a new state, end quote. Gramsci. Quote, it appears as though the entire, quote, logical labor is merely an act of self-reflection on the part of the people, an internal argumentation unfolding within the consciousness of the people, end quote. Gramsci. In examination of Machiavelli's Prince, Gramsci aims to draw attention to politics as a shifting of equilibrium, and to present the modern Prince as an, quote, organism and a, quote, collective will, a move intended in turn to serve as a reminder that the state must be understood as an entity founded upon consensus. Just as Machiavelli is interpreted as a pre-Jacobin, so too is the lack of, quote, an effective Jacobin force, end quote, lamented with regard to modern Italy. Quote, the modern Prince can be nothing other than the standard bearer and organizer of an intellectual moral reform, which means then creating the terrain for a higher development of the collective will of the people and the nation, moving toward the realization of a superior and comprehensive form of modern civilization, end quote. Footnote. See Antonio Gramsci, Humanismus und Renaissance 2, Humanism and Renaissance 2, in Gefängnishefte, Prison Notebooks, Notebook 5, and in Sabina Kabir's edited volume, Antonio Gramsci, Marxismus und Literatur, Marxism and Literature. See Niccolò Machiavelli, Discorsi, Gedanken über Politik und Staatsführung, Discourses, Thoughts on Politics and Statecraft, published in Stuttgart, 1941, 1966. Niccolò Machiavelli, Geschichte von Florenz, History of Florence, Vienna, 1934. And on Machiavelli, Herfried Münkler, Machiavelli, die Begründung des politischen Denkens der Neuzeit aus der Krise der Republik Florenz. Machiavelli, the foundation of modern political thought arising from the crisis of the Florentine Republic, published in Frankfurt, 1982. See Frank Deppe, Niccolò Machiavelli, zur Kritik der reinen Politik, Niccolò Machiavelli on the critique of pure politics, published in Cologne, 1987. Herfried Münkler, Im Namen des Staates, die Begründung der Staatsreisen in der frühen Neuzeit. In the name of the state, the foundation of the raison d'etat in the modern early period, published in Frankfurt, 1987. Karl Mittmeyer, Machiavelli, Moral und Politik zu Beginn der Neuzeit. Machiavelli, Morality and Politics at the Dawn of the Modern Era. On Antonio Gramsci's interpretation of Machiavelli, see Leonardo Paggi. Antonio Gramsci e il moderno principe. Antonio Gramsci and the Modern Prince, 2 volumes, published in Rome, 1970. Federico Sanguinetti, Gramsci e Machiavelli. Gramsci and Machiavelli, published in Rome / Bari, 1981. Leonardo Paggi, La stratégie del potere in Gramsci. Tra fascismo e socialismo in un solo paese, 1923 to 1929. The strategies of power in Gramsci between fascism and socialism in one country, 1923 to 1929. End footnote. Footnote. In this respect, it is consistently viewed as a dynamized element. And it is in reference to I'm not sure. The state. That makes sense. In its struggle for emancipation, the working class requires a certain guarantee. This it finds through a higher form of organization. And this is back to the text, I should say that. In its struggle for emancipation, the working class requires a certain guarantee. This it finds through a higher form of organization, one that in turn manifests itself as a higher collective will. Quote, this guarantee can be provided only through the existence of a strongly centralized international force, one that enjoys the absolute confidence of all its members and is capable of mobilizing them with the same speed and precision with which the global power of capitalism succeeds in mobilizing its own forces, its own interest, and the interests of the bourgeoisie. End quote. Gramsci. The collective will incarnated in the modern prince is the state, specifically the socialist state, as a higher form. Footnote. Quote, before the seizure of power within the state, one cannot set out to completely transform the consciousness of the entire working class. That would be a utopia, for class consciousness as such changes only when the way of life of the class itself has been transformed. That is, when the proletariat has become the ruling class. But the party can and must embody this higher consciousness in its entirety. End quote. Gramsci. And footnote back to the body. The concept of the socialist state is defined in a twofold manner. On the one hand, the socialist state denotes the dictatorship of the proletariat, and on the other, the concept of the socialist state serves as a surrogate for revolution. The necessity of the state remains undisputed. Footnote. From the perspective of the state theory, if one follows Neubert here, what is important to him is the welfare state and the safeguarding of, quote, proletarian law, end quote. Footnote. On the question of the state in Gramsci, see Christine Bucky-Glucksmann, Gramsci et l'État, Paris, 1975. Also, Bucky Glucksmann, Über die politischen Probleme des Übergangs Arbeiterklasse, Staat und passive Revolution in sozialistischer Politik, 1977. Gramsci und der Staat für eine materialistische Theorie der Philosophie, published in Cologne, 1981. Sicorin, Priesters, Studien zur Staatstheorie der italienischen Marxismus, Gramsci und de la Volpe, published in 1981. Back to the body. Quote, the founding of a ruling class, parenthesis, that is, of a state, end parenthesis, is tantamount to the creation of a worldview, end quote. Gramsci. Back to the body. Nevertheless, within Gramsci's conception of the state, overly simplistic notions, such as the idea of the state as a mere instrument of the ruling class, have been transcended. The apparatuses of coercion are distinguished from the civil apparatuses. According to Gramsci, state activity also encompasses economic coercive power. However, as Bucky Glucksmann observes, Gramsci's conception of the state also contains a critique of the merely political. If the state manifests simultaneously as società civile and a, quote, government of functionaries, end quote, then socialism cannot be limited to a socialization of the means of production, for it also entails, quote, a socialization of political life, end quote. Gramsci. Footnote. Gramsci, Bucky Glucksmann notes, methodologically distinguishes two spheres within his concept of the state, quote, that of authority, force, dictatorship, and domination, and that of organization, consent, civiltà, direction, and hegemony, end quote. If societal agencies and institutions within the cultural sector are classified as, quote, ideological state apparatuses, end quote, as they are by Althusser, this leads to dictatorial conceptions. Quote, Althusser effectively abolishes civil society, summarily reclassifying civil societal forces responsible for consensus building as ideological state apparatuses. This results in the direct subsumption of the family, trade unions, churches, etc. under the state, end quote. And I'm not sure who this quote is from. I'm not sure if it's from Glucksmann or Wolfgang Fritz Haug. Footnote. However, the relationship between the state and the organization of the, quote, productive apparatus, appareil productif, is not, she argues, a mechanical one. Christine Bucky Glucksmann argues. Footnote. It is in this guise that the, quote, integral state, end quote, appears, as an entity, quote, constituted by the moments of coercion and consent, end quote. See Alex Demirović, Politische Gesellschaft, Zivile Gesellschaft, Sortiere des integralen Staates by Antonio Gramsci, in Sonja Buckel and Andreas Fischer Lescaner's edited volume, Hegemonie gepanzert mit Zwang, Zivilgesellschaft und Politik im Staatsverständnis, Antonio Gramsci's. The state, she suggests, constitutes an asymmetrical equilibrium of forces. End footnote. I'm going to reread the last paragraph because it feels like, I don't know, I'm feeling spaced out. I feel like I missed something in it. Nevertheless, within Gramsci's conception of the state, overly simplistic notions, such as the idea of the state as a mere instrument of the ruling class, have been transcended. The apparatuses of coercion are distinguished from the civil apparatuses. According to Gramsci, state activity also encompasses economic coercive power. However, as Bucky Glucksmann observes, Gramsci's conception of the state also contains a critique of the merely political. If the state manifests simultaneously as società civile and a, quote, government of functionaries, unquote, then socialism cannot be limited to a socialization of the means of production, for socialism also entails a, quote, socialization of political life, unquote. Bucky Glucksmann. Thus, according to Bucky Glucksmann's analysis, Gramsci's conception of the state involves a dual relationship, that between the state and classes, and that between the state and society. While the notion of strict leadership is indeed retained, it is simultaneously contextualized within the balance of power among the classes. Embedded within this concept of the quote, integral state is a specific form of state functionalism, one held responsible for securing the consensus of the classes involved. It exposes the interface between civil society and political society, quote, public opinion.
Tom, dinner's ready.
Okay. Footnote, it is worth noting following Zabina Kabir here that in his case, there are three distinct periods regarding working class culture. In the first, he advocates for culture for workers in general. In the second, he centers art for workers on futurism. And in the third, Gramsci posits that prolet cult constitutes the appropriate form of expression. Yet even during this third period, futurism and prolet cult are frequently found existing side by side. End footnote. And I jumped ahead on that footnote. It's further down the line. Anyway, back to the text. When viewed in its entirety, Gramsci's philosophy of praxis reveals both innovative features and inherent limitations. It is not solely through his emphasis on the significance of everyday life that it becomes evident Gramsci devotes considerable attention to the social realm, nor is it solely through Gramsci's engagement with everyday life, perceiving it and subjecting its various aspects to critique, that it becomes clear Gramsci attributes immense importance to folklore and mass culture regarding the formation of consciousness among subaltern classes. Gramsci's critical stance is equally manifest whenever, quote, high culture comes into play, specifically where theoretical reflections on language become central. To the extent that culture becomes both a constituent element and an object of critical reflection, the role of intellectuals and their potential integration into the process, a possibility implicitly envisaged within the concept of hegemony, also emerges a key subject of inquiry. Insofar as critique is implicit in all these instances, a critique of science, aimed primarily against, quote, vulgar materialism, end quote, parenthesis, Bukharin, in parenthesis, also becomes a thematic concern, here in contrast to the sometimes dominant tradition of, quote, real dialectics, end quote. Gramsci's interest lies in, quote, material history, end quote, viewing it as a constituent element of his concept of, quote, absolute historicism, end quote. When reflecting upon the dangers opposed by anti-emancipatory politics and processes, specifically, quote, passive revolution, end quote, as a counter-strategy within capitalism, and fascism as a preeminently political counter-strategy, hegemony conceived as a concept of alliance building appears to be an absolute necessity. This underscores the profound significance Gramsci attributes to culture in the broadest sense. Two specific problems arise here. On the one hand, Gramsci attempts to conceptualize culture as a mere expression of production relations, failing to recognize that in his own framework, this remains a purely deductive inference. On the other hand, an ambivalence becomes apparent in his definition of culture, specifically in relation to the subaltern classes. Is culture to be understood as something for the workers, e.g. futurism, or as a workers' culture, e.g. prolet cult? Even when Gramsci subsequently advocates for a, quote, popular culture, this underlying problem remains merely masked. Gramsci's attempt to distinguish società civile as an intermediate sphere situated between the political state realm and the economy points to ambiguities regarding the concepts of hegemony and the economy. The economy, insofar as it constitutes the subject of the critique of political economy, appears to remain theoretically ungrasped. The tripartite division among società civile, società politica, and public opinion constitutes a structural element of bourgeois society. The only difference is that, whereas in the classical conception, bourgeois society is grounded in the economic sphere, in Gramsci's framework, elements of the public sphere and cultural life are effectively duplicated. A comprehensive analysis of the interrelationship between the state, bourgeois society, and cultural spheres, both functionally and historically, still appears to be a desideratum, even though approaches to investigating specific detailed aspects of this relationship do exist. With the turn back toward Jacobinism, the awareness of the distinction between socialist perspectives and bourgeois ideals is lost. Gramsci's reflections on Machiavelli reveal that three distinct elements become conflated. A. The vision of an independent, modern, and secular Italy. B. The dimensions of political leadership. The dimension of political leadership conceived as a struggle for political unity, serving as a bourgeois program. Y. The political emancipation of the working class. The latter, in effect, becomes a subordinate element. The political emancipation of the working class becomes a subordinate element. The contradiction between, on the one hand, the extolling of workers' democracy, autonomous initiative, and self-organization, and on the other, the assertion of a claim to leadership, manifested in the centralism of both party and state, demonstrates that ultimately, and particularly in light of an imminent state functionalism, the nature of the state itself remains theoretically ungrasped. This contradiction becomes starkly evident in the tension between historical thinking, specifically the asserted processual nature of thought in society, and that very same statist functionalism. And yet Gramsci's theory marks a theoretical threshold, a baseline that, in subsequent discourse, becomes a theoretical imperative never to be fallen below. Okay, and that's the end of the chapter titled A Systematizing Approach, or Preliminary Reflections on the Genesis of a New Perspective. It's quite a long video, but it seems like the best way, or I should say only way, to organize it. So it's going to be quite a long video. I apologize for this wind that picks up in the end. I don't think it was blowing directly past me. I didn't really hear any kind of whipping in my ears. I could just hear it in the trees. So hopefully it didn't fuck up the whole recording. But thanks for listening.